Hey guys, tonight we're stepping out of your bedroom and onto a sun-warmed stone path that predates your grandparents, your country's founding, and even the very concept of formal weekend plans. Picture the golden hour just as it begins to bleed into evening. You feel the gentle press of worn leather soles against compacted earth, the quiet rustle of heavy wool brushing past your ankles, and the distant murmur of voices that haven't spoken a single modern syllable. You're walking through a linguistic ghost town where every syllable carries 4 centuries of dust. And honestly, if you try to map this whole journey on a single night without pacing yourself, you probably won't survive the mental jet lag. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your current city and local time so I know who's drifting through the timeline with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the very beginning of the word itself, where language behaves less like a dictionary and more like a slow-moving river carving its own canyon. The journey starts in ancient Latin, a language built on stone roads and military precision, where promenade simply meant to push something forward, to drive it along, to urge movement. You feel that verb in your shoulders as you lean into a wooden cart, in the rhythm of sandals striking Roman pavement, in the practical, unromantic act of getting from point A to point B without wasting daylight. It's a utilitarian route, grounded in necessity rather than leisure, but words have a habit of outgrowing their original jobs. You watch the term cross the Alps and settle into the Gauls' mouths, where the hard edges of Latin soften into the rolling cadence of early French. Promenade sheds its syllables like old boots and emerges as promenade. You no longer drive forward, you simply walk. You take a stroll. You let your feet decide the pace. The military urgency melts into something quieter, something that invites you to linger beneath a canopy of elm branches, or trace the curve of a newly paved courtyard without a destination in mind. You notice how the French tongue wraps around the concept like a well-tailored cloak, turning mere locomotion into an activity worth naming, worth preserving, worth elevating above everyday chores. You carry that softened French word across the English Channel in the mid-16th century, right around the 1560s, when English merchants, diplomats and returning travellers begin packing continental habits alongside imported fabrics and foreign spices. The term promenade arrives with the scent of citrus gardens and damp river stones, landing on English ears that initially stumble over its melodic vowels before gradually adopting it into their own vocabulary. You hear it spoken in drawing rooms where merchants compare notes on foreign markets, in university courtyards where scholars debate theology while pacing, and in royal parks where nobles test the waters of a newly fashionable pastime. It's fascinating how a word can arrive without luggage and still rearrange an entire culture's evening routine. You watch as English scribes and early lexicographers wrestle with the term, trying to pin down its exact meaning in glossaries that struggle to distinguish between a purposeful march and a leisurely amble. Historians still argue whether the 1560s adoption reflected genuine English enthusiasm for European leisure customs or merely a pretentious linguistic trend meant to signal cosmopolitan sophistication among the upper crust. Either way, the word sticks, settling into the language like a comfortable pair of walking boots that slowly break in around your feet. You step into the sensory world of early modern England where promenade isn't yet tied to tuxedos, corsages, or gymnasium decorations. It's simply the act of walking for the sake of walking, a deliberate rebellion against the rigid utility of daily labour. You feel the cool morning air brush your cheeks as you step onto a gravel path lined with manicured hedges, listening to the rhythmic crunch of boots, mixing with the distant toll of a church bell. You notice how the very rhythm of your breathing syncs with your pace, how the mind untangles itself when the body moves without urgency. The English landscape begins to reshape itself around this borrowed concept. Country estates widen their carriage drives to accommodate evening strolls. City planners clear narrow, waste-strewn alleys in favour of straight, sightline-friendly boulevards that invite observation and social display. You walk past iron-wrought gates and freshly planted lime trees, realizing that architecture and vocabulary are quietly conspiring to manufacture a new kind of social space. It's not just about getting somewhere anymore. It's about being seen getting somewhere. It's about the theatre of motion, the curated performance of availability, the unspoken invitation to cross paths, exchange a bow, and let conversation blossom naturally between measured steps. You pause for a moment beneath the shade of an oak tree and listen to the quiet evolution happening around you. The word is no longer a foreign import. It's becoming domesticated, woven into the daily rhythm of parish life and seasonal festivals. You notice how early almanacs begin referencing evening promenades alongside weather patterns and harvest schedules, treating them as predictable, almost meteorological events tied to the turning of the seasons. You watch shopkeepers sweep their thresholds a little more diligently when dusk approaches, knowing that a steady stream of pedestrians means more window shopping, more casual greetings, more opportunities for commerce disguised as courtesy. You realize that language never travels alone, it carries furniture with it. When Promenade crosses into English, it brings expectations about posture, about pacing, about the acceptable distance between two people sharing a path. You feel those expectations in the stiffness of your collar, in the careful placement of your hands, in the deliberate slowness of your stride. It's a social choreography disguised as exercise, a way to measure status not by wealth alone, but by how gracefully you occupy public space. You notice something peculiar as you keep walking, a small historical footnote that most etymologies quietly skip over. In the early decades of Promenade's adoption, several fashion manuals actually prescribed specific footwear for proper promenading, claiming that flat-soled leather slippers with minimal stitching reduced foot fatigue and encouraged a smoother, more elegant gait. Some tailors even marketed walking coats, with slightly shorter hemlines and reinforced shoulder seam, designed specifically to allow freedom of movement without sacrificing silhouette. You smile at the idea that 4 centuries ago, people treated strolling with the same technical seriousness we now reserve for running marathons or training for triathlons. It's a quiet reminder that leisure was never truly accidental. It was engineered, debated, and optimized long before modern fitness trackers turned steps into data points. The path ahead curves gently toward a wider avenue where the vocabulary continues to stretch and adapt. You listen to merchants borrow the term for commercial districts, to poets use it as a metaphor for emotional wandering, to physicians recommend it as a gentle remedy for melancholy and sluggish digestion. You feel how the word absorbs new layers, how it becomes flexible enough to describe everything from a quiet riverside amble to a grand theatrical procession through a newly paved urban square. The Latin route pushed forward, the French version softened it into a stroll, and the English adoption gave it a stage. You walk through the linguistic handoff, watching each culture leave its fingerprint on the term while preserving its core promise: movement with intention, pace with purpose, presence with grace. The evening air cools slightly, carrying the scent of damp soil and distant wood smoke, and you keep your rhythm steady. There's more ground to cover, more centuries to trace, more social rules waiting to tighten around your steps. But for now, you just keep walking, letting the history settle into your shoulders like a well-worn coat, feeling the quiet certainty that every modern tradition began as someone's attempt to simply move forward. You step onto the gravel now, and the texture beneath your feet changes. Smaller stones, more deliberate placement, the kind of surface engineered to produce a specific sound when boot meets path. It's not just walking anymore, it's performance. You feel the weight of observation pressing gently against your shoulders, the quiet awareness that every step you take is being measured, not for distance but for grace. This is aristocratic leisure, and it operates on an entirely different frequency than the hurried errands of merchants or the laborious trudge of field hands. You're not moving to arrive, you're moving to be seen moving. The pace is slow, almost meditative, each footfall placed with the precision of a dancer who knows the entire garden is watching. You notice how the elites of 17th and 18th century Europe transformed the simple act of walking into a complex social theatre, where status wasn't just displayed through clothing or carriage, but through the very rhythm of your stride. You adjust your posture instinctively, shoulders back, chin level, hands clasped loosely behind your back, or resting lightly on a polished walking stick. The rules aren't written in any official manual you've read, but you feel them in the air, in the way others position themselves relative to you, in the subtle nods and half smiles that acknowledge your presence without demanding conversation. This is courtship by circumference, flirtation by footfall. You walk the same loop 3 times, not because you're lost, but because repetition signals availability, patience, and the luxury of unstructured time. You notice how couples separate and rejoin with choreographed ease, how a gloved hand might brush another's sleeve for just a moment longer than necessary, how a whispered comment about the weather can carry the weight of a marriage proposal when delivered at the correct angle beneath a lime tree. The promenade becomes a slow-motion ballroom, a dance without music where the steps are measured in social capital rather than beats per minute. You pass a group of young nobles near the fountain, and you catch fragments of their conversation, discussions of recent hunts, upcoming salons, the scandalous cut of a new gown worn at last week's opera. But you also notice what they don't say aloud, the way they position themselves to maximize visibility from the manor's upper windows. The careful selection of companions who enhance rather than diminish their social standing. The strategic timing of their appearance, arriving just as the afternoon light softens enough to flatter complexions, but before dusk obscures the details of their attire. You realize that every element of this leisurely walk has been optimized for display. Even the route itself is curated, designed to showcase the family's landscaping prowess, their imported statuary, their ability to command space without appearing to try. It's leisure as labor, relaxation as reputation management. You feel the fabric of your coat against your skin. Fine wool, tailored to allow movement without sacrificing silhouette, dyed in a color that signals wealth without screaming for attention. You notice how others around you are similarly attired, each garment a careful negotiation between fashion and function, between individual expression and group conformity. The aristocracy didn't just walk, they promenaded in full costume, treating the garden path as an extension of the drawing room, where every accessory carried meaning. A lace cuff wasn't just decorative, it signaled access to specialized craftsmen. A particular shade of blue wasn't just pretty, it indicated knowledge of newly available dyes from distant colonies. You walk among living catalogues of global trade, each step a quiet testament to networks of power that stretched far beyond the garden gate. Historians still argue whether the aristocratic promenade was primarily a tool for social cohesion or a mechanism for exclusion. Some scholars suggest that these carefully orchestrated walks helped bind elite communities together, creating shared rituals that reinforced mutual obligations and collective identity. Others contend that the very strictness of promenade etiquette, the unspoken rules about who could walk where, with whom, and when, served primarily to police boundaries, to make visible the invisible lines that separated the truly privileged from the merely wealthy. You feel both possibilities as you walk, the warmth of shared recognition when you exchange a bow with a familiar face, and the subtle chill of being subtly redirected away from a group whose company you haven't formally been invited to join. The promenade doesn't just reflect social hierarchy. It actively manufactures it, one measured step at a time. You pause near a bed of roses, pretending to admire their color, while actually observing the intricate choreography unfolding around you. A young woman completes her 3rd circuit of the path, her pace just slightly quicker than before, her eyes flickering toward a particular bench where a gentleman has just taken up position. You watch as their paths converge naturally, as if by accident, though you know better. This is the promenade as map-making algorithm, a slow, public, deniable way for families to assess potential alliances without the pressure of formal introduction. You notice how the woman's mother appears a few paces behind, ostensibly admiring the same roses, actually monitoring the interaction with the precision of a diplomat observing treaty negotiations. Courtship here isn't private, it's communal theatre, where every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word is performed for an audience of peers who will carry the news forward through the social network. You catch a quirky detail that most histories of aristocratic leisure overlook. Some estates actually employed pace setters, Servants trained to walk at the exact speed considered most elegant for promenade purposes. These individuals would subtly guide the flow of foot traffic, ensuring that no one moved too quickly, which suggested anxiety or lower-class haste, or too slowly, which implied laziness or poor health. You smile at the idea that even the rhythm of leisure required professional management, that the appearance of effortless grace was itself a carefully orchestrated production. It's a reminder that nothing about aristocratic life was truly accidental. Even relaxation was engineered, rehearsed, and staffed. The sun begins its descent, casting long shadows that stretch across the path like silent participants in the ritual. You notice how the changing light alters the social dynamics, how conversations grow quieter, more intimate, as dusk provides a natural veil for slightly bolder exchanges. The promenade doesn't end when the sun sets, it transforms. Torches are lit along the main avenue, casting a warm, flickering glow that softens features and encourages a different kind of confidence. You feel the air cool against your skin, hear the distant chime of a dinner bell that signals not an end but a transition, the walk giving way to the banquet, the public performance yielding to the private gathering. But for now, you keep walking, letting the gravel crunch beneath your feet, letting the weight of centuries of social expectation settle into your shoulders like a well-tailored coat. You realize that this aristocratic version of the promenade isn't just about walking, it's about time. The elite didn't just have money, they had hours to spend without productive purpose. They could afford to move slowly because their survival didn't depend on speed. You feel that luxury in your own pacing, in the way you can linger over a view without checking a pocket watch, in the freedom to let conversation meander like the path itself. It's a privilege that echoes through the centuries, that shapes how we still think about leisure today. When you scroll through social media feeds filled with carefully curated vacation photos or sunset walks, you're participating in a distant echo of this aristocratic impulse. The desire to transform movement into meaning, to make time visible through the theatre of presence. The path curves toward the manor house now, its windows glowing with candlelight, promising warmth and conversation, and the next act of the evening's social performance. You feel the pull of that invitation, the gentle pressure to transition from public display to private gathering. But you also feel the quiet satisfaction of having completed the ritual correctly, of having moved through the space with the appropriate pace, the proper posture, the measured grace that signals belonging. You've walked the walk, literally and figuratively, and in doing so, you've participated in a tradition that turned locomotion into language, steps into status, leisure into legacy. The gravel gives way to stone paving as you approach the entrance, and you adjust your stride one final time, preparing to cross the threshold from garden to hall, from promenade to party, from the slow theatre of display to the next chapter of the evening's carefully choreographed social dance. You feel the shift before you see it. The air grows slightly heavier, charged with the quiet tension of unspoken rules. The gravel path beneath your feet seems to demand more precision now, as if each stone has been placed not just for drainage but for moral instruction. This is the promenade as formal social ritual, and you're no longer just walking. You're navigating a living rulebook written in glances, gestures, and the careful spacing between bodies. The 17th and 18th centuries didn't just enjoy leisurely strolls. They codified them, transforming casual movement into a complex language of propriety, where every detail carried weight. You adjust your gloves without thinking, feeling the snug fit of kid leather against your skin, and you realize that even this small act is part of the performance. Attire isn't decoration here, it's punctuation, marking the beginning and end of acceptable social interactions. You notice how the path itself has been subtly engineered to enforce etiquette. Wider sections allow for parallel walking, 2 abreast for intimate conversation, 3 for family groups, never 4 unless you're royalty. Narrower passages force single file, creating natural opportunities for brief, sanctioned exchanges as you pass someone of interest. You watch how people manage these transitions, how a gentleman might step slightly aside to allow a lady to pass, how a group might pause mid-conversation to let a superior rank proceed without interruption. It's traffic management for the soul, a system designed to minimize social friction while maximizing opportunities for carefully controlled connection. You feel the weight of expectation in your shoulders, the quiet pressure to execute each maneuver with the effortless grace that suggests you've been practicing since childhood. The rules of engagement are precise, though rarely spoken aloud. You learn them through observation, through the gentle correction of an elder's hand on your elbow, through the subtle withdrawal of attention when you misstep. You discover that timing matters as much as attire. Morning promenades favor lighter colors and simpler silhouettes, appropriate for the freshness of dawn. Afternoon walks demand more formal wear, signaling your readiness for potential social encounters. Evening promenades require your finest, as dusk brings the highest concentration of eligible companions and influential observers. You notice how the sun's position isn't just a matter of comfort. It's a social clock dictating not only what you wear but who you might reasonably expect to meet, and what kind of conversation would be appropriate under those particular rays. You walk beside a companion now, and you feel the intricate dance of proximity. Too close suggests intimacy you haven't earned. Too distant implies coldness or disdain. The acceptable distance shifts based on your relationship, your relative status, the formality of the occasion, and even the width of the path. You learn to read the subtle cues. A slight lean inward signals openness to deeper conversation. A measured step backward creates polite space for disagreement. A synchronized pace suggests mutual respect. You notice how gloves mediate touch. A bare hand would be shocking, but a gloved finger lightly brushing a sleeve can convey volumes without violating propriety. It's communication through constraint, where limitation becomes the very medium of expression. Historians still argue whether the elaborate etiquette of the promenade served primarily to facilitate genuine social connection or to create elaborate barriers that preserved existing hierarchies. Some scholars point to the way these rituals allowed young people to meet potential partners under supervised but not stifling conditions, creating a structured space for courtship that balanced freedom with protection. Others contend that the very complexity of the rules, the precise angles of bowing, the acceptable topics for pathside conversation, the intricate hierarchy of who could initiate an exchange, functioned primarily as a gatekeeping mechanism, ensuring that only those with the proper upbringing, leisure time, and cultural knowledge could fully participate. You feel both truths as you walk, the warmth of a well-executed greeting and the subtle chill of being gently excluded from a conversation whose references you don't quite grasp. You catch a quirky detail that most etiquette manuals politely omit. Some fashionable promenaders actually carried small ornate timepieces not just to check the hour, but to subtly signal their social availability. A watch chain displayed prominently might indicate you were open to interruption. A timepiece tucked discreetly into a pocket suggested you preferred not to be disturbed. Even more peculiar, certain circles developed a code based on how the watch was held. Face up meant you were receptive to light conversation. Face down signaled serious business, and holding it by the chain without looking at the face was a discreet way to indicate you were waiting for someone specific. You smile at the idea that timekeeping itself became a form of social semiotics, that the simple act of checking the hour could carry layers of meaning visible only to those initiated into the code. You notice how attire functions as a moving billboard of social information. The cut of a coat, the shade of a ribbon, the style of a hat. Each element communicates your family's wealth, your regional origins, your political leanings, and your awareness of current fashion. You feel the weight of these signals as you adjust your cravat, knowing that a poorly tied knot might suggest carelessness, or worse, ignorance of proper form. You watch how others read your appearance as you walk past, how a slight nod might acknowledge a particularly elegant choice of waistcoat, how a barely perceptible frown might register a fashion misstep. It's a constant, low-stakes evaluation, a running commentary conducted in the silent language of fabric and cut. The ritual extends beyond individual presentation to group dynamics. You observe how families promenade together in carefully ordered formations, parents leading, children following in age order, unmarried daughters positioned for maximum visibility, but never so far forward as to appear forward. You notice how servants trail at a respectful distance, close enough to assist, but far enough to remain invisible to polite society. You feel the quiet pressure of these arrangements, the way they reinforce family hierarchy even in leisure, the way they turn a simple walk into a moving portrait of domestic order. It's not just about looking good, it's about performing your place in the social ecosystem with every step. You pause near a decorative urn, pretending to examine its craftsmanship, while actually observing the intricate choreography of a nearby group. A young man executes a perfect bow at precisely the right moment, his angle calibrated to show respect without subservience. A lady responds with a graceful curtsy, her eyes lowered just enough to signal modesty, but raised in time to catch his gaze. You watch how their conversation unfolds within the acceptable parameters. Weather, garden, recent cultural events, never venturing into politics or personal finance unless explicitly invited by a change in tone or setting. It's diplomacy in miniature, a practice ground for the larger social negotiations that will define their adult lives. You realize that the promenade isn't just recreation, it's rehearsal. The air carries the scent of orange blossoms and damp earth, and you feel the day's warmth beginning to soften into evening coolness. You notice how the changing light alters the social atmosphere, how conversations grow slightly more intimate as shadows lengthen, how the rules relax just enough to allow for bolder exchanges without violating propriety. You feel the gentle pull of transition, the quiet understanding that the formal promenade is giving way to the next phase of the evening's social ritual. But for now, you keep walking, letting the rhythm of the path settle into your bones, letting the weight of centuries of social expectation guide your steps without conscious thought. You realize that this formalization of leisure wasn't arbitrary. It reflected a deeper cultural belief that every human interaction, no matter how casual, contributed to the maintenance of social order. The promenade became a microcosm of society itself, a space where hierarchy was performed, reinforced, and occasionally negotiated through the careful management of movement, appearance, and conversation. You feel that legacy in your own pacing, in the way you still instinctively adjust your behavior based on context, in the quiet satisfaction of executing a social maneuver correctly. The rules may have evolved, but the impulse remains, to move through the world with awareness, with grace, with the understanding that how we walk says as much about us as where we're going. The path ahead curves toward a more secluded section of the garden, where the rules soften slightly, where conversation might venture into slightly more personal territory under the cover of fragrant hedges and dappled light. You feel the shift in atmosphere, the gentle release of tension that comes with moving from public display to semi-private exchange. But you also carry the discipline of the formal promenade with you, the muscle memory of proper posture, the instinct for appropriate pacing, the awareness that even in relaxation, there is form. You've walked through the codification of leisure, feeling how spontaneity was shaped into structure, how casual movement became cultural performance. And as you step onto the next section of path, you carry that understanding forward, letting the history of etiquette settle into your stride, like the comfortable weight of a well-tailored coat. You feel the ground shift beneath your feet again, not in texture this time, but in geography. The gravel of European gardens gives way to the worn stone pathways of northeastern American campuses, where ivy clings to brick buildings and the air carries the crisp scent of autumn leaves mixed with pipe smoke and fresh ink. You're no longer walking through aristocratic estates or royal parks. You're stepping onto the hallowed grounds of late 19th century universities, where the old world ritual of promenade is about to undergo a distinctly American transformation. You adjust your collar instinctively, feeling the starched stiffness of a formal shirt against your neck. And you realize that the rules you learned on those European paths are being rewritten here, adapted to a new culture that values both tradition and innovation in equal measure. You notice how the Grand Promenade arrives on these campuses, not as a leisurely stroll but as a formal processional, a choreographed entrance that opens collegiate balls and society dances. You walk in line now, part of a carefully ordered sequence where class rank, academic achievement, and social standing determine your position in the procession. The pace is measured, dignified, each step designed to showcase your formal attire while maintaining the decorum expected of young scholars. You feel the weight of expectation in your posture, the quiet pressure to execute this ceremonial walk, with the grace that suggests you belong among the educated elite. It's Promenade as performance, but the stage has changed, and so has the audience. You watch as European customs blend with American practicality, as the slow, status-driven walks of aristocratic gardens evolve into the structured introductions of college social life. The promenade becomes less about lingering conversation and more about formal presentation, a way to announce your arrival, to be seen by peers and potential partners, to participate in a ritual that marks your transition from student to society member. You notice how the attire has shifted too. Tailcoats and white ties for gentlemen, floor-length gowns and kid gloves for ladies, each outfit a careful negotiation between European formality and American aspiration. You feel the fabric of your own formal wear against your skin, the weight of tradition woven into every stitch. The transformation accelerates as the decades progress. You see how the Grand Promenade, once a lengthy processional that opened hours of dancing, begins to shorten, to simplify, to adapt to the faster pace of American college life. The term itself starts to shed syllables in casual conversation. Promenade becomes prom in student slang, a linguistic shorthand that reflects both affection and efficiency. You hear the shorter term spoken in dormitories and dining halls, written in invitation cards and society columns, and you realize that language is evolving alongside the ritual itself. Historians still argue whether the American prom evolved more directly from European courtship rituals or from indigenous college traditions like class banquets and formal dinners, with some scholars pointing to the influence of military academy balls and others emphasizing the role of women's colleges in shaping the modern event. You feel both lineages as you walk, the European formality in your posture and the American informality in your growing comfort with the abbreviated name. You catch a quirky detail that most college histories politely overlook. Some early university proms actually required students to submit their dance cards for faculty approval weeks in advance, with professors reviewing potential partners based on academic standing, family reputation, and even handwriting quality. Even more peculiar, certain institutions maintained promenade monitors, upperclassmen tasked with ensuring that couples maintained proper distance during the processional, and that conversation topics remained appropriately elevated. You smile at the idea that even rebellion against tradition required administrative oversight, that the appearance of youthful spontaneity was itself a carefully supervised production. It's a reminder that institutional culture has always balanced freedom with structure, even in moments designed for celebration. You notice how gender dynamics play out in this American adaptation. The promenade, once a space where aristocratic women could exercise subtle agency through pace and positioning, becomes in the college context a more rigidly choreographed exchange where young men typically initiate and young women respond. You feel the weight of these expectations as you navigate the processional, aware that every gesture carries implications beyond the immediate moment. You watch how the ritual serves as both opportunity and constraint, offering a sanctioned space for courtship while reinforcing conventional roles. It's a delicate balance, one that reflects the broader tensions of a society negotiating between old-world traditions and new-world possibilities. The path you walk now leads toward a grand hall, its windows glowing with candlelight and the sound of string music drifting through the open doors. You feel the pull of that invitation, with the quiet excitement of transition from outdoor ceremony to indoor celebration. But you also carry the discipline of the processional with you, the muscle memory of proper pacing, the awareness that this moment marks more than just entertainment. It signals your entry into a broader social world. You notice how other students share this mixture of anticipation and anxiety, how the formal attire feels both empowering and constraining, how the ritual creates a shared experience that bonds participants even as it highlights individual differences. You realize that this American college adaptation didn't just shorten a word, it transformed a ritual. The European promenade emphasized leisure, display, and the slow accumulation of social capital through repeated visible presence. The American Prom, by contrast, emphasizes event, milestone, and the concentrated performance of identity within a single highly anticipated evening. You feel that shift in your own expectations, in the way you've been preparing for this night, not as one of many similar walks, but as a singular occasion worthy of special effort and memory. It's a different relationship to time, to tradition, to the very purpose of social ritual. The air inside the hall is warmer, scented with flowers and polish, and the faint sweetness of punch. You complete the processional, taking your place among your peers, and you feel the quiet satisfaction of having executed the ritual correctly. The grand promenade has served its purpose. You've been seen, you've participated, you've marked your place within the social order of your institution. But you also sense that this is just the beginning. The dancing is about to start, the conversation is about to flow, the night is about to unfold in ways that no amount of preparation can fully predict. You've walked the walk, literally and figuratively, and in doing so, you've participated in the transformation of a centuries-old tradition into something distinctly, enduringly American. You notice how the abbreviation prom continues to spread beyond campus, entering the broader cultural vocabulary as colleges and universities influence mainstream social practices. You hear the term in newspaper society pages, in family conversations about upcoming events, in the planning of high school celebrations that emulate collegiate traditions. You feel the ripple effect of this linguistic and cultural adaptation, the way a ritual born in European gardens and refined on American campuses begins to shape the expectations of young people across the country. It's a reminder that traditions don't just evolve in isolation. They travel, they adapt, they find new expressions in new contexts. The music swells slightly, signaling the transition from processional to dance, and you feel the gentle pressure to shift your focus from walking to partnering, from presentation to participation. But you carry the history of the promenade with you, the understanding that every step you take tonight echoes centuries of social ritual, linguistic evolution, and cultural adaptation. You've traced the journey from Latin verb to French stroll to English adoption, to aristocratic performance to formal etiquette to American college tradition. You felt how each transformation preserved something of the original while adding new layers of meaning. And as you prepare to take your first dance, you realize that the prom, in all its modern manifestation, still carries the DNA of that original impulse, to move forward with intention, to mark time with grace, to find connection through the shared rhythm of ritual. The evening unfolds around you, filled with music and conversation and the quiet joy of shared experience. You dance, you talk, you laugh, and you feel the weight of tradition settling into something lighter, something more personal, something that belongs to you, even as it connects you to those who walked similar paths before. You've completed the first part of this journey, tracing the etymology and historical origins of a ritual that continues to shape how we celebrate, how we connect, how we mark the passage from one phase of life to another. And as the night deepens and the candles burn low, you carry that understanding forward, letting the history of the promenade settle into your memory like the comfortable weight of a well-worn formal coat, ready for the next chapter of the story. You step off the campus path and onto something broader, something designed not just for passage but for presence. The ground beneath your feet changes again. Now it's smooth wooden planks warmed by sun, or wide stone paving laid in elegant patterns, or compacted gravel bordered by manicured hedges. You're no longer walking through private gardens or institutional courtyards. You're entering the dedicated public spaces built specifically for the art of promenading. The 19th century didn't just adopt the promenade, it architecturally embraced it, constructing entire environments designed to elevate a simple walk into a social experience. You feel the intention in every surface, every curve, every carefully placed bench that invites you to pause, without ever suggesting you stop moving entirely. You find yourself on a seaside boardwalk first, the salt air tangling with the scent of freshly cut timber and distant fried dough. The planks beneath your feet have a slight give, a gentle spring that absorbs your step and returns it with a soft echo. You notice how the boardwalk isn't just a path. It's a stage oriented toward the ocean, designed to frame the horizon while keeping you visible to fellow promenaders. Railings curve at regular intervals, creating natural alcoves for brief conversations without blocking the flow of foot traffic. You watch how the architecture manages crowds, wide enough for groups to walk abreast, narrow enough to encourage proximity, lined with gas lamps that cast a flattering glow as dusk approaches. It's urban design as social engineering, where every measurement serves the dual purpose of comfort and display. You transition from the boardwalk to a grand boulevard, and the sensory landscape shifts dramatically. Here, the path is flanked by symmetrical rows of trees whose canopies form a living ceiling, dappling the sunlight into patterns that dance across your shoulders as you walk. The scale is monumental, designed to impress as much as to facilitate movement. You feel the weight of history in the stonework, the precision of masonry that has weathered decades of footsteps without losing its elegance. You notice how the boulevard isn't just wide, it's layered. Central carriageways for carriages, flanked by pedestrian promenades, bordered by service lanes for deliveries, all orchestrated to keep different types of traffic separate while maintaining visual harmony. You walk among strangers who feel like companions, united by the shared experience of moving through a space designed specifically for the pleasure of movement. You duck briefly into a covered arcade, and the atmosphere changes again. The open sky gives way to glass-panelled roofs that filter light into a soft, even glow. Shop windows line both sides, but they're set back just enough to allow unobstructed passage, creating a rhythm of display and movement that encourages browsing without congestion. You feel the temperature shift, cooler in summer, warmer in winter, as the architecture moderates the elements. The sound of footsteps takes on a different quality here, echoing gently off marble floors and ornate columns, creating a subtle acoustic backdrop that makes conversation feel intimate even in a crowd. You notice how the arcade isn't just a shelter, it's a destination, a place where the act of walking becomes inseparable from the experience of looking, of being seen, of participating in a carefully curated version of public life. You emerge into a park promenade, and the scale softens once more. Here the path winds rather than runs straight, inviting you to discover views rather than simply traverse distance. Benches appear at scenic overlooks, positioned to frame particular vistas, a pond, a sculpture, a particularly elegant cluster of flowers. You feel how the landscape architecture guides your attention without demanding it, how the gentle curves of the path create natural opportunities for chance encounters without forcing interaction. You notice how seasonal plantings change the character of the promenade throughout the year. Spring blossoms encourage slow, appreciative pacing, summer shade invites lingering conversation, autumn colors prompt reflective strolls, winter pathways cleared of snow become stages for crisp, invigorating walks. The park promenade doesn't just accommodate leisure, it cultivates it, shaping your experience through the thoughtful arrangement of nature and design. Historians still argue whether these dedicated promenade spaces emerged primarily from genuine democratic impulses to create accessible public leisure, or from elite desires to control and display social hierarchy in newly urbanizing environments. Some scholars point to the way boardwalks and park promenades opened previously exclusive experiences to broader populations, suggesting a progressive vision of shared civic pleasure. Others contend that the very design of these spaces, the careful separation of classes through pricing, timing, or location, served primarily to maintain social distinctions even while appearing to democratize leisure. You feel both possibilities as you walk, the warmth of shared enjoyment when you exchange a smile with a stranger on the boardwalk, and the subtle awareness of unspoken boundaries that govern who feels comfortable where. You catch a quirky detail that most architectural histories politely omit. Some grand promenades actually incorporated hidden acoustic features designed to enhance conversation at specific points. Certain arcades used curved ceilings to create whispering galleries, where softly spoken words could travel surprisingly far, allowing discreet exchanges across distances. Even more peculiar, some seaside boardwalks featured sections with slightly different plank spacing that produced distinct rhythmic sounds when walked upon, creating an unofficial code where experienced promenaders could signal their mood or availability through their stepping pattern. You smile at the idea that even the sound of walking, was engineered for social purposes, that the architecture of leisure included auditory dimensions invisible to the casual observer. You notice how these dedicated spaces didn't just accommodate promenading, they transformed it. The boardwalk turned a beach walk into a performance oriented toward both ocean and audience. The boulevard elevated a city stroll into a procession through civic grandeur. The arcade converted shopping into a theatrical experience where movement and display were inseparable. The park promenade reframed nature appreciation as a social ritual rather than solitary contemplation. You feel how each environment shaped not just where you walked, but how you walked, what you noticed, who you might meet, and what kind of conversation felt appropriate. Architecture became choreography, designing not just spaces but behaviors. You pause near a decorative fountain in the park promenade, watching how the water's movement creates a natural focal point that draws people together without requiring interaction. You notice how the sound of flowing water masks nearby conversations just enough to create privacy within public space. How the mist cools the air on warm days. How the play of light on water adds a dynamic visual element that changes with the time of day. You realize that every feature of these dedicated promenade spaces serves multiple purposes: aesthetic pleasure, social facilitation, environmental comfort, and symbolic meaning. Its design as diplomacy, creating environments that encourage connection while respecting boundaries, that celebrate public life while preserving individual experience. You feel the historical weight of these spaces as you continue walking. The boardwalk reminds you of coastal communities that built their identities around seaside leisure. The boulevard echoes the grand urban renovations that reshaped European cities in the 19th century. The arcade speaks to the rise of consumer culture and the integration of commerce with social life. The park promenade reflects the growing belief that access to green space was essential to urban well-being. You're not just walking through pretty places, you're moving through layers of social history, each surface and structure carrying the imprint of the values and aspirations that created it. The path ahead curves toward a viewpoint that offers a panoramic perspective on the spaces you've traversed. From this vantage, you can see how the boardwalk, boulevard, arcade, and park promenade aren't isolated experiments, but parts of a broader cultural movement that recognize the power of designed public space to shape social experience. You notice how these environments influenced each other, how innovations in one context migrated to others, how the success of dedicated promenade spaces inspired further investment in pedestrian-oriented design. It's a reminder that cultural practices don't evolve in isolation. They interact with architecture, with urban planning, with changing ideas about leisure, community, and the good life. You feel the day beginning to soften into evening, the light taking on that golden quality that makes even ordinary surfaces glow. You notice how the dedicated promenade spaces transform as daylight fades. Gas lamps flicker to life along the boulevard, casting long shadows that add drama to the architectural details. The arcade's glass roof diffuses the remaining sunlight into a warm, inviting glow. The park promenade's pathways become silhouettes against the darkening sky, inviting contemplative strolls under emerging stars. You realize that these spaces were designed not just for daytime use, but for the full cycle of leisure, accommodating different moods and social rhythms as the hours progress. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of these dedicated spaces settle into your pace. You've experienced how architecture can elevate a simple walk into a social ritual, how designed environments can facilitate connection while preserving individual experience, how public spaces can reflect and shape cultural values. The boardwalk, boulevard, arcade, and park promenade aren't just places to walk. They're testaments to a historical moment that believed in the transformative power of thoughtful design, that invested in creating environments where leisure could flourish, where community could form, where the simple act of moving through space could become a source of pleasure, connection, and meaning. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to explore how these dedicated spaces influenced broader urban planning, how the principles of promenade design reshaped entire cities. But for now, you let the experience of these purpose-built environments settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that the spaces we walk through don't just accommodate our lives, they shape them, one carefully designed step at a time. You feel the city itself begin to move beneath your feet, not in the literal sense of earthquakes or construction, but in the deliberate reorganization of space to accommodate the graceful flow of pedestrians. The dedicated promenade spaces you just experienced weren't isolated experiments. They were prototypes, proof-of-concept projects that convinced urban planners to rethink entire cities around the principle of elegant pedestrian movement. You step onto a wider avenue now, one that feels less like a street and more like a statement, and you realize you're walking through the legacy of 19th century urban renewal that prioritized the promenade not as an amenity, but as an organizing principle. You find yourself in Paris first, though the city feels unfamiliar, transformed. The narrow, winding medieval alleys you might have expected have given way to broad, straight boulevards that stretch toward distant monuments with theatrical precision. You feel the scale of Haussmann's renovation in your bones. The way the avenues are wide enough to accommodate carriages, pedestrians, and tree-lined medians without congestion. The way sightlines are carefully managed to create dramatic reveals of architecture and public art. You notice how the buildings flanking these new boulevards maintain a consistent height and facade treatment, creating a harmonious streetscape that feels less like random development and more like a carefully composed stage set. You walk beneath the dappled shade of uniformly planted trees, feeling how the urban environment has been engineered not just for efficiency, but for aesthetic pleasure, for the experience of moving through space as a form of civic enrichment. You pause at a cafe terrace spilling onto the sidewalk, and you notice how the architecture encourages lingering without obstructing flow. The wide sidewalks accommodate both steady pedestrian traffic and stationary socializing, with tables positioned to allow conversation while maintaining clear passage for those who prefer to keep moving. You feel how Haussmann's Paris didn't just build wider streets. It reimagined the relationship between public and private space, between movement and pause, between the individual walker and the collective experience of the city. The promenade isn't confined to a park or a boardwalk here. It's woven into the very fabric of urban life, making every stroll through the city a potential encounter with beauty, culture, and community. You transition to Vienna, and the sensory landscape shifts again. The Ringstrasse unfolds before you like a ceremonial ribbon wrapped around the city's historic core, a grand boulevard that replaces old fortifications with a procession of cultural institutions, public parks, and elegant residences. You feel the intentionality in every curve, every vista, every placement of sculpture and fountain. This isn't just a road, it's a narrative in stone and greenery, designed to tell the story of a city proud of its heritage and confident in its future. You walk past the Opera House, the University, the Parliament, each building positioned to be appreciated from the pedestrian's perspective, each facade calibrated to reward the slow, attentive gaze of the promenader. You notice how the Ringstrasse manages different types of traffic with subtle sophistication. Central lanes accommodate carriages and early automobiles, while wide, tree-lined sidewalks prioritize pedestrian experience. Tram lines run along the edges, providing public transportation without disrupting the flow of foot traffic. You feel how the design encourages a particular pace, not hurried, not sluggish, but measured, allowing you to appreciate the architecture while maintaining the rhythm of urban movement. It's city planning as choreography, where every element works together to create a harmonious experience of motion and observation. You catch a glimpse of London's Rotten Row as you continue your journey, and the atmosphere shifts once more. Here, the promenade principle takes a more specialized form, a dedicated horse-riding path through Hyde Park that became, by social osmosis, a pedestrian spectacle as well. You feel the packed earth beneath your feet, firm but forgiving, designed to provide secure footing for horses while remaining comfortable for those walking alongside. You notice how Rotten Row isn't just a path, it's a social institution, a place where the elite of London society gathered to see and be seen, where fashion was displayed, where alliances were formed, where the simple act of moving through space carried layers of social meaning. You observe how Rotten Row influenced broader London planning, encouraging the development of other pedestrian-oriented spaces throughout the city's parks and gardens. You feel how the success of this specialized promenade demonstrated the public appetite for designed walking experiences, inspiring investments in paths, viewpoints, and resting places that transformed public parks from mere green spaces into stages for social life. It's a reminder that urban planning doesn't just respond to existing needs. It can create new possibility for how people interact with their environment and with each other. Historians still argue whether these grand urban renovations were primarily motivated by genuine concern for public health and social welfare, or by desires to control urban populations, facilitate military movement, and increase property values for elite landowners. Some scholars emphasize the progressive aspects of Haussmann's Paris, the improved sanitation, the increased light and air, the creation of accessible public spaces, suggesting a humanitarian vision of urban improvement. Others point to the displacement of working-class communities, the strategic width of boulevards that made barricade building difficult during uprisings, and the economic benefits that accrued primarily to property-owning classes, arguing that social control was always part of the calculation. You feel both truths as you walk: the genuine pleasure of moving through a beautifully designed city, and the subtle awareness that such beauty often comes with hidden costs and excluded voices. You catch a quirky detail that most urban histories politely overlook. Some grand boulevards actually incorporated subtle optical illusions to enhance the pedestrian experience. Certain Parisian avenues were designed with slightly converging sides that made perspectives appear longer and more dramatic than they actually were, creating a sense of grandeur that exceeded physical measurements. Even more peculiar, some Ringstrasse intersections featured carefully angled building corners that created unexpected visual reveals as you walked, rewarding attentive promenaders with sudden glimpses of domes, spires, or sculptures that weren't visible from a distance. You smile at the idea that urban planners were essentially stage managers, using architectural tricks to choreograph the emotional experience of walking through the city. You notice how these urban planning innovations didn't just accommodate promenading, they elevated it to a civic virtue. The wide boulevards of Paris, the ceremonial Ringstrasse of Vienna, the specialized paths of London's parks, all sent a message that pedestrian experience mattered, that how people moved through cities was worthy of thoughtful design, that public space could be both beautiful and functional. You feel how this shift in planning philosophy reflected broader cultural changes, growing appreciation for leisure time, increasing recognition of public health benefits associated with walking, emerging ideas about the right of all citizens to access well-designed urban environments. You pause at a viewpoint along the Ringstrasse, taking in the panorama of architecture and greenery, and you realize that these urban renovations created more than just pretty streets. They created new ways of being urban. The promenade principle, prioritizing graceful pedestrian flow, designing for visual pleasure, facilitating social encounter, became a template for urban development that continues to influence city planning today. You notice how modern pedestrian zones, waterfront parks, and complete streets initiatives echo these 19th century innovations, adapting promenade principles to contemporary needs and values. You feel the historical weight of these transformations as you continue walking. Haussmann's Paris reminds you of the power of comprehensive planning to reshape urban experience. Vienna's Ringstrasse speaks to the potential of cultural institutions to anchor public space. London's Rotten Row reflects the enduring appeal of specialized pedestrian environments. Together, they illustrate how the simple act of walking can inspire profound reimaginings of urban life, how the desire for elegant pedestrian flow can reshape entire cities, how the promenade can evolve from a leisure activity into an organizing principle for urban design. The light begins to soften as afternoon yields to evening, and you notice how these grand urban spaces transform with the changing light. Gas lamps flicker to life along the boulevards, casting a warm glow that highlights architectural details and creates pockets of intimacy within the grand scale. The trees that lined your path by day become silhouettes against the darkening sky, their branches framing views of illuminated buildings and distant monuments. You feel how the promenade principle accommodates different rhythms and moods, how urban design can support both the energetic flow of daytime movement and the contemplative pace of evening strolls. You continue walking, letting the legacy of these urban planning innovations settle into your stride. You've experienced how cities can be redesigned around the experience of pedestrian movement, how the principles of promenade can scale from dedicated paths to entire urban fabrics, how thoughtful planning can transform the simple act of walking into a source of civic pride, social connection, and aesthetic pleasure. The boulevards of Paris, the Ringstrasse of Vienna, the paths of London's parks. They aren't just historical artifacts. They're living testaments to a vision of urban life that values grace, beauty, and the human-scale experience of moving through space. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to explore how these elegant urban designs interacted with the social codes that governed who could walk where, when, and how. But for now, you let the experience of these transformed cities settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that the spaces we inhabit don't just contain our lives, they shape them, one carefully planned avenue at a time. You feel the air change again, not in temperature or scent, but in tension. The grand boulevards and elegant park paths you've been walking aren't just beautiful, they're governed by an intricate web of unspoken rules that determine who belongs where, when, and how. You adjust your posture without thinking, feeling the subtle pressure of social expectations settle onto your shoulders like an invisible cloak. This is the promenade as social code, where every step, every glance, every gesture carries meaning far beyond the simple act of moving from one place to another. You're not just walking through space, you're navigating a living language of class, etiquette, and visibility. You notice how pacing itself becomes a marker of status. The elite don't hurry, they glide, their steps measured and deliberate, conveying the luxury of unstructured time. You feel the temptation to quicken your stride, to cover ground efficiently, but you resist, remembering that speed signals necessity, and necessity suggests labor, and labor places you lower on the social ladder. You watch how others manage their pace, the confident, slow roll of the aristocrat, the slightly quicker but still controlled walk of the professional class, the hurried steps of those who can't afford to linger. It's a silent hierarchy written in rhythm, where how fast you move says as much about your place in society as what you wear or how you speak. You approach a gathering near a decorative fountain, and you feel the intricate dance of greeting protocols. A slight nod suffices for acquaintances, a deeper bow for superiors, a warm smile and brief pause for equals, a carefully calibrated distance for those whose company you'd prefer to avoid without causing offense. You notice how gloves mediate these exchanges. A gloved hand extended for a handshake signals formality. A gloved finger lightly touching a brim acknowledges without interrupting. The absence of gloves suggests intimacy or, in some contexts, impropriety. You feel the weight of these micro-decisions, each one a small performance that reinforces your understanding of social boundaries and your place within them. You realize that timing matters as much as technique. The promenade isn't just about where you walk, it's about when. Morning hours favor family groups and health-conscious walkers. Their pace brisk but not hurried, their attire practical but polished. Afternoon promenades attract the socially ambitious, those who understand that visibility during peak hours maximizes opportunities for connection and display. Evening strolls draw couples and confidants, the softer light and cooler air encouraging more intimate conversation under the cover of growing darkness. You feel how the clock governs not just your schedule but your social strategy, how choosing when to promenade can signal your priorities, your availability, your understanding of the unspoken calendar of social life. You notice how visibility functions as social currency. The most desirable positions on the promenade aren't necessarily the most comfortable, they're the most visible. A bench facing the main thoroughfare, a curve in the path that forces convergence, a viewpoint that frames you against a picturesque backdrop. These are the real estate of social capital. You feel the subtle competition for these spots, the quiet maneuvering that positions you where you'll be seen by the right people at the right time. It's not vanity, it's strategy, a a recognition that in a world where reputation travels on foot, being seen correctly is half the battle. Historians still argue whether these elaborate etiquette codes primarily facilitated genuine social connection or served primarily as mechanisms of exclusion that preserved existing hierarchies. Some scholars point to the way promenade rituals created structured opportunities for young people to meet potential partners, for neighbors to build community, for newcomers to integrate into established social networks. Others contend that the very complexity of the rules, the precise angles of acknowledgement, the acceptable topics for pathside conversation, the intricate hierarchy of who could initiate an exchange, functioned primarily as a gatekeeping system, ensuring that only those with the proper cultural knowledge and social training could fully participate. You feel both possibilities as you walk, the warmth of a well-executed greeting and the subtle chill of being gently excluded from a conversation whose references you don't quite grasp. You catch a quirky detail that most etiquette manuals politely omit. Some fashionable promenaders actually carried small ornate fans not just for cooling, but as subtle signaling devices. The angle at which a fan was held, the speed of its flutter, the hand that held it, all could convey specific messages to those initiated into the code. A fan held high and still might indicate availability for conversation. A fan fluttering rapidly near the cheek could signal playful interest. A fan closed and tapped lightly against the palm might suggest a desire to end an interaction. Even more peculiar, certain circles developed a code based on which side of the face the fan was held, with left indicating personal matters and right suggesting social or business topics. You smile at the idea that even a simple accessory could become a complex language, that the promenade required not just social grace but semiotic fluency. You notice how attire functions as a moving billboard of social information, but you also realize that clothing is just the beginning. The way you wear your clothes matters as much as what you wear. A perfectly tied cravat suggests attention to detail. Slightly loosened ties might indicate relaxed confidence or, in certain contexts, careless disregard. The cleanliness of your gloves, the polish of your boots, the precise folding of a pocket square. Each detail contributes to the overall impression you project as you move through social space. You feel the weight of these expectations, the quiet pressure to maintain a standard of presentation that signals your understanding of promenade etiquette without appearing to try too hard. You observe how group dynamics follow their own unspoken rules. Families promenade in carefully ordered formations, parents leading, children following in age order, unmarried daughters positioned for maximum visibility, but never so far forward as to appear forward. You notice how servants trail at a respectful distance, close enough to assist but far enough to remain invisible to polite society. You feel the quiet pressure of these arrangements, the way they reinforce family hierarchy even in leisure, the way they turn a simple walk into a moving portrait of domestic order. It's not just about looking good, it's about performing your place in the social ecosystem with every step. You pause near a decorative urn, pretending to examine its craftsmanship, while actually observing the intricate choreography of a nearby group. A young man executes a perfect bow at precisely the right moment, his angle calibrated to show respect without subservience. A lady responds with a graceful curtsy, her eyes lowered just enough to signal modesty, but raised in time to catch his gaze. You watch how their conversation unfolds within the acceptable parameters. Weather, gardens, recent cultural events, never venturing into politics or personal finance unless explicitly invited by a change in tone or setting. It's diplomacy in miniature, a practice ground for the larger social negotiations that will define their adult lives. You realize that the promenade isn't just recreation, it's rehearsal. You feel the historical weight of these codes as you continue walking. The pacing protocols remind you of a time when leisure itself was a marker of status, when the ability to move slowly signaled freedom from labor. The greeting rituals speak to cultures that valued formality as a way of managing social complexity, of creating predictable interactions in an increasingly diverse urban environment. The timing conventions reflect societies that understood visibility as a resource, that recognized the power of being seen at the right moment. You're not just following rules, You're participating in a historical tradition that used movement as a language, that turned walking into a form of social communication. The light begins to soften as afternoon yields to evening, and you notice how the etiquette codes adapt to the changing atmosphere. Conversations grow slightly more intimate as shadows lengthen, the rules relaxing just enough to allow for bolder exchanges without violating propriety. You feel the gentle pull of transition, the quiet understanding that the formal promenade is giving way to the next phase of the evening's social ritual. But you also carry the discipline of the code with you, the muscle memory of proper pacing, the instinct for appropriate acknowledgement, the awareness that even in relaxation there is form. You realize that these unspoken rules weren't arbitrary. They reflected a deeper cultural belief that every human interaction, no matter how casual, contributed to the maintenance of social order. The promenade became a microcosm of society itself, a space where hierarchy was performed, reinforced, and occasionally negotiated through the careful management of movement, appearance, and conversation. You feel that legacy in your own pacing, in the way you still instinctively adjust your behavior based on context, in the quiet satisfaction of executing a social maneuver correctly. The rules may have evolved, but the impulse remains, to move through the world with awareness, with grace, with the understanding that how we walk says as much about us as where we're going. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of these social codes settle into your stride. You've experienced how etiquette can transform a simple walk into a complex language of status, how unspoken rules can create both connection and boundary, how visibility can function as a form of currency in the economy of social life. The pacing protocols, greeting rituals, timing conventions, and visibility strategies aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders that human interaction has always been choreographed, that social life has always required a delicate balance of freedom and structure, of expression and restraint. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to explore how these elite codes eventually democratized, how the rituals of the privileged spread to broader populations as industrialization created new leisure time and new aspirations. But for now, you let the experience of these social codes settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that the rules we follow, spoken or unspoken, don't just constrain our behavior, they shape our identities, one carefully calibrated step at a time. You feel the ground beneath your feet change texture again, not because the architecture has shifted, but because the people walking beside you have. The crisp wool of aristocratic coats gives way to sturdy cotton and practical wool blends. The polished leather of elite boots softens into well-maintained but work-worn soles, and the air carries a different energy, less calculated display, more genuine enjoyment. You're walking through the democratization of the promenade, where the rituals once reserved for the privileged few begin to ripple outward, carried by the expanding leisure time and rising aspirations of the 19th century working and middle classes. You adjust your own attire without thinking, feeling the comfortable weight of a Sunday best coat that isn't tailored by a master craftsman, but is clean, pressed, and worn with pride. You notice how industrialization created the conditions for this shift. Factories established regular hours, railways enabled weekend excursions, and labor movements gradually secured shorter work weeks, carving out pockets of time that weren't dedicated to survival. You feel the novelty of having hours to spend without productive purpose, the quiet excitement of leisure as a right rather than a privilege. The promenade, once the exclusive domain of those who could afford to move slowly, begins to welcome those who earned their rest through labor. You walk among families emerging from tenements and row houses, their faces bright with the anticipation of a few hours of unstructured time, their steps carrying the rhythm of a week's work, but also the lightness of temporary freedom. You find yourself on a seaside boardwalk on a Saturday afternoon, and the atmosphere feels different from the elite promenades you experienced earlier. The pace is livelier, the conversations louder, the laughter more unrestrained. You notice how working-class families adapt the promenade to their own needs and values. Children run ahead in short bursts before being gently reeled back in. Couples walk arm in arm with a comfort that suggests familiarity rather than performance. Groups of friends cluster together, sharing jokes and snacks purchased from vendors who understand this new market. It's not a rejection of promenade etiquette, it's a reinterpretation, a way of claiming public leisure space while infusing it with your own cultural rhythms. You pause near a vendor selling paper cones of roasted chestnuts, and you notice how commerce and leisure intertwine in this democratized promenade. Small businesses flourish along popular walking routes, offering affordable treats, souvenirs, and services that cater to the new pedestrian traffic. You feel how this economic dimension transforms the promenade from a purely social ritual into a multifaceted experience that combines exercise, entertainment, and modest consumption. It's not the grand expenditure of aristocratic leisure. It's the careful enjoyment of small pleasures, the satisfaction of treating yourself after a week of labor, the quiet pride of participating in a cultural practice once reserved for your social superiors. You observe how the middle classes, in particular, embrace the promenade as a tool of social aspiration. You watch families dress in their finest available attire, not to mimic aristocracy exactly, but to signal their respectability, their stability, their membership in a growing class that values education, thrift, and moral virtue. You feel how the promenade becomes a stage for performing these values. Parents walking with well-behaved children, couples demonstrating appropriate affection, friends engaging in wholesome conversation. It's not about exclusion anymore. It's about inclusion through demonstration, about claiming a place in public life by embodying the behaviors that society rewards. Historians still argue whether this democratization of promenading represented genuine social progress or merely a new form of respectability politics that pressured working and middle classes to adopt elite behaviors as a condition of acceptance. Some scholars emphasize the liberatory aspects, the way public promenades opened previously exclusive spaces to broader populations, creating opportunities for cross-class interaction, community building, and the assertion of a right to leisure. Others contend that the pressure to promenade correctly, to dress appropriately, to maintain proper demeanor, to consume in approved ways, functioned as a subtle mechanism of social control, encouraging conformity to middle-class norms while marginalizing those who couldn't or wouldn't perform respectability. You feel both truths as you walk, the genuine joy of shared public space, and the quiet anxiety of knowing that your behavior is being judged, that your place in this new social order isn't guaranteed but must be continuously earned. You catch a quirky detail that most social histories politely omit. Some working-class promenaders actually developed their own subtle codes to signal solidarity and distinguish themselves from elite walkers. Certain neighborhoods adopted distinctive ways of tying scarves or arranging hat ribbons that identified community membership without drawing negative attention. Even more peculiar, some industrial towns established promenade clubs that pooled resources to rent better attire for weekend walks, creating rotating wardrobes that allowed members to participate in the ritual without bearing the full cost of fashionable clothing. You smile at the idea that even adaptation required organization, that the democratization of leisure involved its own forms of cooperation and innovation. You notice how seasonal timing shifts in this democratized context. While elite promenaders might stroll year-round, adjusting attire and route to weather conditions, working and middle-class families often concentrate their promenading on weekends and holidays, making these occasions feel more special, more concentrated, more worthy of preparation. You feel how this compression of leisure time changes the emotional texture of the promenade. It's not a casual daily habit, but a cherished event, a reward for labor, a chance to reset before returning to work. You watch how this anticipation shapes behavior, how families save small amounts throughout the week to afford a treat during their promenade, how children count down the days until Saturday afternoon, how the ritual becomes an anchor point in the rhythm of working life. You realize that visibility functions differently in this democratized promenade. For the elite, being seen was about reinforcing status. For the working and middle classes, being seen is about claiming belonging. You feel the quiet pride of walking in a public space that wasn't designed with you in mind, but that you've made your own through presence, through numbers, through the simple assertion of your right to be there. You notice how this shift in visibility, changes the social dynamics of the promenade. It's less about performing for an exclusive audience and more about participating in a shared experience. Less about distinguishing yourself from others and more about finding connection with those who share your circumstances. You pause at a viewpoint overlooking a bustling boardwalk, watching how different groups navigate the same space with different rhythms and intentions. Elite promenaders still move with measured grace, but they're no longer the only presence. Working-class families claim sections of the path with their own energy, their own conversations, their own ways of enjoying the moment. Middle-class couples walk somewhere in between, balancing aspiration with authenticity, performance with pleasure. You feel how the promenade becomes a microcosm of a changing society, a space where old hierarchies don't disappear, but where new possibilities for interaction and identity begin to emerge. You notice how the democratization of promenading influences broader cultural attitudes toward leisure and public space. As more people claim the right to walk for pleasure, cities begin to invest in parks, boardwalks, and pedestrian zones that serve diverse populations. You feel how this shift reflects a growing recognition that leisure isn't a luxury reserved for the few but a human need that deserves public support. The promenade, once a marker of exclusion, becomes a catalyst for inclusion, inspiring investments in environments that welcome all who wish to walk, to rest, to connect. You feel the historical weight of this transformation as you continue walking. The working-class families enjoying their Saturday stroll remind you of labor movements that fought for leisure time. The middle-class couples demonstrating respectability speak to cultures that valued self-improvement and social mobility. The vendors serving affordable treats reflect economies that adapted to new patterns of consumption. You're not just witnessing a change in who promenades. You're experiencing a shift in who belongs in public space, who deserves leisure, who gets to define what pleasure looks like. The light begins to soften as afternoon yields to evening, and you notice how the democratized promenade accommodates different rhythms as the day progresses. Families with young children head home as dusk approaches, while young adults and couples linger, enjoying the cooler air and the slightly more relaxed atmosphere. You feel how the promenade flexes to serve different needs at different times, how public space can be both structured and adaptable, how a single ritual can mean different things to different people, without losing its core promise, the simple joy of moving through the world with intention and company. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of this democratized promenade settle into your stride. You've experienced how leisure can spread beyond its original boundaries, how cultural practices can adapt to new populations without losing their essential appeal, how public space can become more inclusive without becoming less meaningful. The working-class families, the aspiring middle classes, the vendors and entrepreneurs who serve them, they aren't just participating in someone else's tradition. They're reshaping it, making it their own, ensuring that the promenade evolves to reflect the values and needs of a changing society. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to move beyond the social and architectural evolution of promenading to explore its cultural and artistic significance. But for now, you let the experience of this democratized ritual settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that traditions don't belong to any one class or era. They live and change through the people who claim them, one Sunday stroll at a time. You feel the atmosphere shift again, not in the physical space around you, but in the texture of thought itself. The gravel and stone beneath your feet seem to soften into the rustle of turning pages, the scent of fresh air blending with the faint aroma of ink and aged paper. You're no longer just walking through physical spaces designed for promenading. You're stepping into the literary imagination, where the act of walking becomes a narrative device, a metaphor for thought, a stage for encounter and critique. You adjust your pace without thinking, feeling how the rhythm of your steps begins to sync with the rhythm of prose, each footfall marking a beat in the story you're now walking through. You find yourself in the company of romantic poets first, their words echoing around you like whispers carried on the breeze. You feel how the promenade becomes a vehicle for introspection in their works, a way to externalize the wandering mind. When Wordsworth describes his solitary walks through the Lake District, he's not just recording scenery. He's using the physical act of walking to map the contours of memory, emotion, and philosophical reflection. You notice how the path itself becomes a metaphor, the straight road representing certainty, the winding trail suggesting doubt, the fork in the path embodying choice. You walk alongside these literary promenaders, feeling how their footsteps on the page invite you to contemplate your own journey, to see your own life as a narrative unfolding with each step. You transition to the novels of the 19th century, and the promenade takes on a new function: social observation and critique. You feel how authors like Jane Austen use walking scenes to reveal character and advance plot, without the formality of drawing room conversation. A chance encounter on a country lane, a deliberate avoidance on a garden path, a hurried walk that betrays emotional distress. These aren't just plot devices, they're sophisticated tools for exploring the tensions between individual desire and social expectation. You notice how the promenade allows characters to speak more freely than they might indoors, to reveal truths in motion that they'd conceal in stillness. You walk through these literary landscapes, feeling how the simple act of walking together becomes a space for intimacy, for confession, for the quiet revolutions that change lives. You pause beneath a gas lamp that seems to flicker with the light of modernist experimentation, and you notice how the promenade evolves in 20th century literature. Here, walking becomes less about social navigation and more about existential exploration. You feel how writers like Virginia Woolf use the rhythm of footsteps to mirror the flow of consciousness, how the urban promenade becomes a canvas for fragmented perception, for the fleeting impressions that compose modern experience. You walk through streets that feel both concrete and dreamlike, where every storefront, every passerby, every shift in light becomes a trigger for memory, association, and philosophical musing. The promenade isn't just a setting anymore, it's a method, a way of knowing the world through movement. You observe how the literary promenade often serves as a space for social critique, where authors use the ritual of walking to expose the contradictions of their societies. You feel how Charles Dickens employs London promenades to highlight class disparity, where the elegant stroll of the wealthy contrasts sharply with the hurried, desperate movements of the poor. You notice how the same path can mean different things to different characters, how the promenade becomes a microcosm of social inequality, a stage where privilege and struggle perform their daily dance. You walk through these literary cities, feeling the weight of historical injustice in the very paving stones, hearing the echoes of voices that used the promenade not just for leisure but for survival, for resistance, for the quiet assertion of humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. Historians still argue whether the literary promenade primarily served as a neutral narrative device or as a politically charged space that reinforced or challenged social hierarchies. Some scholars emphasize the way walking scenes allowed authors to explore universal human experiences, love, loss, self-discovery, suggesting that the promenade functioned as a timeless metaphor for the journey of life. Others contend that these literary walks were deeply embedded in their historical moments, reflecting and sometimes critiquing the specific social codes, gender roles, and class structures of their eras. You feel both possibilities as you walk: the timeless resonance of a solitary thinker, finding clarity in motion, and the historically specific weight of a character, navigating the constraints of their social world. You catch a quirky detail that most literary analyses politely overlook. Some 19th century authors actually timed their writing sessions to coincide with their daily promenades, using the rhythm of walking to overcome writer's block or generate new ideas. Even more peculiar, certain writers developed personal rituals around their literary walks, specific routes that triggered creativity, particular times of day that enhanced focus, even distinctive footwear that they believed improved their mental flow. You smile at the idea that the physical act of walking was so intertwined with the creative process that authors treated their promenades as essential work, not just leisure or inspiration, but a fundamental part of their craft. You notice how gender shapes the literary promenade in profound ways. For male characters, walking often represents freedom, exploration. the ability to claim public space without question. For female characters, the promenade can be a site of both opportunity and constraint, a chance for limited independence, for observation, for connection, but always within boundaries defined by propriety and safety. You feel how authors navigate these tensions, using the promenade to explore the complexities of women's lives in societies that both celebrated and restricted their mobility. You walk alongside literary heroines who use their walks to gather information, to make decisions, to assert agency within the spaces allowed to them, feeling how the simple act of moving through the world becomes a form of quiet rebellion. You realize that the literary promenade isn't just about individual characters. It's about communities, about the way walking together creates bonds, facilitates conversation, builds shared understanding. You feel how novels use group promenades to explore dynamics of friendship, family, and social circles, how the rhythm of walking together can synchronize emotions, create intimacy, reveal tensions that might remain hidden in more formal settings. You notice how the promenade becomes a space for the performance of identity, where characters try on different versions of themselves, where relationships are tested and strengthened through the shared experience of movement. You pause at a literary landmark, a bench mentioned in a famous novel, a path described in a beloved poem, and you feel the weight of intertextuality, the way one writer's promenade echoes another's, how the literary tradition of walking creates a conversation across time and space. You notice how contemporary authors continue to use the promenade as a narrative device, adapting it to new contexts, new technologies, new understandings of identity and community. You feel how the literary promenade evolves but endures, how the basic human experience of finding meaning in motion continues to inspire stories that resonate across generations. You notice how the sensory details of literary promenades, the scent of rain on pavement, the sound of footsteps on gravel, the play of light through leaves, create immersive experiences that draw readers into the narrative world. You feel how authors use these details not just for atmosphere but for emotional resonance, how a description of a walk can evoke nostalgia, anticipation, melancholy, or joy without explicitly stating those feelings. You walk through these literary landscapes, feeling how the promenade becomes a vehicle for empathy, inviting you to experience the world through another's senses, to feel the weight of their thoughts, to share in their discoveries. You realize that the literary promenade reflects a deeper truth about human experience, that we often think best when we move. That conversation flows more naturally when we walk side by side rather than face to face, that the rhythm of footsteps can synchronize with the rhythm of thought. You feel how authors have intuited this connection between physical and mental movement, how they've used the promenade to explore the relationship between body and mind, between environment and consciousness, between individual experience and shared humanity. The light begins to soften as you continue walking, and you notice how literary promenades often use changing light to mirror emotional shifts, how dusk can signal reflection, dawn can suggest renewal, the golden hour can enhance moments of connection or revelation. You feel how authors use the temporal dimension of walking to structure narrative, how the duration of a promenade can compress or expand story time, how the journey from one place to another can parallel a character's internal transformation. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of literary promenades settle into your stride. You've experienced how the simple act of walking can become a powerful narrative device, how authors have used the promenade to explore introspection, social critique, existential questioning, and human connection. The Romantic poets, the 19th century novelists, the modernist experimenters, they didn't just write about walking. They walked through their stories, inviting readers to join them in finding meaning in motion. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to explore how visual artists captured the promenade in paint and print, translating the experience of walking into images that continue to shape how we see public life. But for now, you let the experience of literary promenades settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that stories don't just describe our walks. They shape how we experience them, how we find meaning in movement, how we turn the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other into a journey of discovery. You feel the world around you begin to blur at the edges, not from fatigue but from a shift in perception. The crisp details of the path beneath your feet soften into dabs of colour. The solid forms of buildings and trees dissolve into suggestions of light and shadow, and the air itself seems to shimmer with the quality of paint applied in quick, confident strokes. You're no longer just walking through the promenade. You're stepping into a canvas where the act of seeing becomes as important as the act of moving, where the fleeting moment is captured not in words but in pigment, where the social ritual of walking is transformed into visual poetry. You adjust your gaze without thinking, feeling how your eyes begin to scan the scene, not for narrative but for impression, not for plot but for light. You find yourself in Paris in the 1870s, and the boulevard before you buzzes with the energy of modern life rendered in revolutionary style. You feel how the Impressionists didn't just paint the promenade, they painted the experience of seeing it, capturing the way gaslight flickers on wet pavement, how the haze of a summer afternoon softens the edges of distant figures, how the movement of crowds creates a rhythm that can be suggested through brushwork rather than detailed representation. You walk alongside Manet's figures in A Bar at the Folies Bergère, feeling how the promenade extends even into interior spaces, how the boundary between public and private blurs when the act of being seen becomes the subject itself. You notice how these artists treated the promenade not as a static backdrop but as a dynamic event, where light changes, where people move, where the very act of observation becomes part of the composition. You transition to Renoir's sun-dappled scenes, and the atmosphere shifts to warmth and conviviality. You feel how his brushstrokes seem to dance with the same joy as his subjects, how the play of light through tree branches creates patterns that echo the rhythm of social interaction. You walk through his Dance at Le Moulin de la Galette, feeling how the promenade isn't just about walking anymore. It's about gathering, about celebration, about the pleasure of shared space rendered in colours that seem to glow from within. You notice how Renoir captures not just the appearance of promenaders but their mood, their energy, the intangible quality of a moment that feels both specific and universal. You feel how his art invites you not just to observe the promenade but to participate in its joy, to feel the warmth of connection that draws people together in public space. You pause near a café terrace captured by Toulouse-Lautrec, and the scene takes on a different edge, more intimate, more theatrical, more aware of performance. You feel how his distinctive style, with its elongated figures and bold outlines, captures the promenade as a stage where identities are constructed and displayed. You notice how he focuses not on the grand boulevards, but on the smaller spaces where social rituals play out. The café, the dance hall, the park bench, where a private conversation unfolds against a public backdrop. You walk through his Montmartre, feeling how the promenade becomes a space of both freedom and constraint, where individuals seek connection while maintaining the masks required by social life. You feel how his art doesn't just document the promenade, it interrogates it, asking what we reveal and what we conceal when we move through spaces designed for display. You observe how the realists approach the promenade with a different sensibility, less concerned with light and atmosphere than with social truth. You feel how artists like Gustave Caillebotte used precise perspective and detailed rendering to capture the experience of walking through Haussmann's Paris, how his Paris street, Rainy Day presents the promenade not as a romantic escape, but as a complex social environment where class, gender, and urban design intersect. You notice how realist painters often focused on the mundane aspects of promenading, the wet pavement, the umbrellas, the slightly awkward spacing between strangers, suggesting that meaning resides not just in grand gestures, but in the quiet details of everyday life. You walk through these painted streets, feeling how art can elevate the ordinary, can find beauty and significance in the simple act of moving through a city with other people. Historians still argue whether the Impressionist and Realist fascination with the promenade primarily reflected genuine democratic impulses to document modern life, or served as a form of aesthetic colonization that transformed public experience into commodity for elite consumption. Some scholars emphasize the way these artists brought attention to previously overlooked aspects of urban life, suggesting a progressive vision that valued the experiences of ordinary people. Others contend that the very act of painting promenades, of framing public space as subject for artistic contemplation, functioned primarily to reinforce the position of the artist and viewer as privileged observers, turning lived experience into aesthetic object. You feel both possibilities as you walk, the genuine appreciation for the beauty of modern life and the subtle awareness that the act of representation always involves selection, interpretation, and power. You catch a quirky detail that most art histories politely omit. Some Impressionist painters actually developed specialized easels and palettes designed for plein-air promenade painting, allowing them to work quickly while walking or standing in crowded public spaces. Even more peculiar, certain artists adopted distinctive walking sticks that doubled as portable maul sticks, tools for steadying the hand while painting, allowing them to capture fleeting moments of light and movement without sacrificing technical precision. You smile at the idea that the equipment of art was itself adapted to the rhythm of promenading, that the desire to capture the experience of walking influenced not just what artists painted, but how they painted it. You notice how fashion functions as a visual language in these paintings, but how artists used clothing not just for period accuracy but for social commentary. You feel how the cut of a coat, the shade of a dress, the style of a hat could signal class, occupation, aspiration, or rebellion without a single word of explanation. You walk through galleries of painted promenaders, noticing how artists captured the tension between individual expression and social conformity, how clothing becomes a site where personal identity negotiates with collective expectation. You feel how these visual details invite you to read the social landscape as carefully as the artist did, to see the stories written in fabric and cut, to understand that what we wear when we walk says as much about us as where we're going. You realize that these artists didn't just document the promenade, they helped define how we see it. The Impressionist emphasis on light and atmosphere teaches you to notice how the same path can look different at times of day, how weather transforms familiar scenes, how perception itself is fluid and subjective. The realist attention to social detail encourages you to look beyond surface beauty to the structures and relationships that shape public experience. You feel how art doesn't just reflect reality, it shapes how we perceive it, how the way painters saw the promenade influences how you see it now, centuries later. You pause before a painting that captures a moment you recognize. A couple walking arm in arm, their postures suggesting intimacy without overt display, their path curving toward a destination that feels both specific and open-ended. You feel how the artist has frozen a moment that was inherently fleeting, how the act of painting transforms the transient into the enduring, how the promenade, always about movement and change, can be captured in a still image that invites contemplation. You notice how the painting doesn't just show you what the promenade looked like. It invites you to feel what it felt like to be there, to move through that space, to share that moment with another person. You observe how these visual representations of the promenade influenced broader cultural attitudes toward public space and social interaction. You feel how paintings of bustling boulevards and peaceful parks helped legitimize the idea that urban leisure was worthy of artistic attention, that the experiences of ordinary people in public spaces mattered, that beauty could be found not just in nature or history, but in the rhythms of modern life. You notice how these images traveled beyond galleries, reproduced in prints and illustrations that brought the experience of the promenade to those who couldn't access it directly, creating a shared visual culture that shaped expectations about how public life should look and feel. You realize that the visual art of the promenade reflects a deeper truth about human experience, that we see the world through layers of interpretation, that our perception is shaped by culture, by technology, by the artistic traditions we inherit. You feel how painters taught viewers to notice light, to appreciate atmosphere, to find meaning in the interplay of figures and space, how they trained the eye to see not just objects but relationships, not just surfaces but stories. You walk through these painted promenades, feeling how art can expand your capacity for attention, can deepen your appreciation for the visual richness of everyday life. can invite you to see the familiar with new eyes. The light begins to soften as you continue walking, and you notice how these artists captured the changing quality of light at different times of day, how they understood that the same scene could tell different stories under different illumination. You feel how their attention to temporal shifts invites you to notice the subtle transformations that occur as day yields to evening, how the promenade becomes a different experience as shadows lengthen and artificial light begins to glow. You notice how this artistic sensitivity to time and light echoes the social rhythms of promenading itself, how both art and ritual recognize that meaning emerges not from static observation, but from attentive engagement with change. You continue walking, letting the visual language of promenade painting settle into your perception. You've experienced how artists can transform the simple act of walking into a subject worthy of contemplation, how different styles can reveal different dimensions of the same experience, how the act of representation shapes how we see the world around us. The Impressionists, the Realists, the distinctive voices of Manet, Renoir, Toulouse-Lautrec, they didn't just paint the promenade. They taught us how to see it, how to find beauty in movement, how to understand public life as a complex, layered, visually rich experience. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to explore how the promenade influenced fashion, how the ritual of walking for display drove the evolution of specialized attire that continues to shape how we dress for public life. But for now, you let the experience of visual promenades settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that art doesn't just document our walks. It shapes how we see them, how we find meaning in the interplay of light and movement, how we turn the simple act of moving through space into an opportunity for aesthetic appreciation and social understanding. You feel the texture of your clothing against your skin with new awareness, not as mere coverage but as communication, as performance, as a carefully negotiated statement about who you are and who you hope to be seen as. The path beneath your feet remains the same, but the ritual of walking has transformed your relationship to attire, turning every garment into a deliberate choice, every accessory into a signal, every stitch into a participation in a broader cultural conversation about propriety, aspiration, and the art of public presentation. You adjust your collar without thinking, feeling how the very act of promenading has elevated dressing from practical necessity to social strategy, from personal preference to cultural performance. You notice how the promenade drove the creation of specialized attire, designed specifically for the ritual of walking in public. Promenade dresses emerge with slightly shorter hems that clear the ground just enough to prevent tripping while maintaining elegance, with reinforced seams that accommodate movement without sacrificing silhouette, with fabrics chosen for their ability to look good in motion as well as in stillness. You feel how these garments aren't just fashionable, they're functional, engineered for the specific demands of a ritual that requires both beauty and practicality. You walk among women whose outfits represent careful negotiations between modesty and display, between comfort and style, between individual expression and social expectation. You transition to menswear and notice how the promenade influenced the evolution of tailored walking suits that balance formality with freedom of movement. You feel how jackets are cut slightly longer in the back to accommodate the posture of walking, how trousers are tailored to allow a natural stride without bunching, how boots are designed with soles that provide traction on varied surfaces while maintaining a polished appearance. You notice how accessories become essential components of the promenade ensemble, walking sticks that serve both as fashion statements and practical supports, gloves that mediate touch while signaling refinement, hats that frame the face while protecting from the elements. You feel how every element of male promenade attire reflects a similar negotiation between function and form, between individual comfort and social performance. You pause near a vendor selling parasols, and you notice how even protective accessories become fashion statements in the context of promenading. You feel how parasols aren't just about shade. They're about posture, about the graceful arc of an arm, about the way a tilted canopy can frame a face or create a moment of privacy within public space. You watch how gloves function as more than hand protection. They mediate social touch, signal formality or intimacy based on whether they're worn or removed, and add a layer of refinement to every gesture. You realize that in the world of promenade fashion, nothing is merely utilitarian. Every item carries social meaning. Every choice contributes to the overall impression you project as you move through public space. You observe how seasonal changes drive fashion evolution in promenade culture. Spring promenades favor lighter fabrics and pastel colors that echo the renewal of the natural world. Summer attire emphasizes breathability and sun protection without sacrificing elegance. Autumn walking wear incorporates richer textures and deeper hues that complement the changing landscape. Winter promenade fashion balances warmth with mobility, using layered construction and insulating materials that don't bulk the silhouette. You feel how the ritual of promenading creates a calendar of fashion, a rhythm of adaptation that keeps attire in dialogue with both environment and social expectation. You notice how this seasonal awareness encourages a more thoughtful relationship to clothing, where what you wear isn't just about personal preference, but about participating in a shared cultural rhythm. Historians still argue whether the fashion innovations driven by promenading primarily represented genuine progress in functional design, or served primarily as mechanisms of consumer culture that encouraged constant expenditure on new garments to maintain social standing. Some scholars emphasize the practical improvements in clothing construction that emerged from promenade culture. The development of more durable fabrics, the refinement of tailoring techniques, the creation of garments that better accommodated movement, suggesting that the ritual drove meaningful innovation in fashion technology. Others contend that the pressure to maintain an appropriate promenade appearance functioned primarily as a form of social control, encouraging conformity to ever-changing standards of taste, while marginalizing those who couldn't afford to keep up with fashion trends. You feel both truths as you walk, the genuine satisfaction of wearing clothing that fits well and functions effectively, and the subtle anxiety of knowing that your appearance is being evaluated, that your place in the social order is partly determined by your ability to dress appropriately for the occasion. You catch a quirky detail that most fashion histories politely omit. Some fashionable promenaders actually carried small, specialized kits for on-the-spot clothing maintenance, allowing them to address minor mishaps without interrupting their walk. Even more peculiar, certain circles developed a code based on the way accessories were arranged. The angle of a parasol, the folding pattern of a handkerchief in a breast pocket, the specific knot used to tie a scarf, all could convey subtle messages about mood, availability, or social intention to those initiated into the code. You smile at the idea that even the smallest details of attire could become a complex language, that promenade fashion required not just aesthetic sense but semiotic fluency, that the art of walking in public involved a continuous performance of visual communication. You notice how gender shapes promenade fashion in profound and sometimes contradictory ways. For women, promenade attire often emphasizes grace, modesty, and the careful management of visibility. Garments that allow movement while maintaining propriety. Fabrics that drape beautifully without revealing too much. Accessories that enhance rather than distract from the overall impression. For men, promenade fashion often emphasizes authority, competence, and the subtle display of status. Tailoring that suggests physical capability without sacrificing refinement. Accessories that signal taste without appearing ostentatious. Colors and patterns that convey confidence without demanding attention. You feel how these gendered expectations create different pressures and possibilities, how the same ritual of walking can require different performances of identity based on who you are. You realize that promenade fashion isn't just about individual expression. It's about community, about the way shared standards of attire create a sense of belonging, about the way clothing can signal membership in a particular social world. You feel how the ritual of dressing for a promenade, selecting garments, arranging accessories, checking your appearance in a mirror before stepping out, becomes a form of preparation that extends the ritual beyond the walk itself, that turns getting ready into part of the experience. You notice how this preparatory aspect of promenade fashion creates opportunities for intimacy and connection. for conversations about taste and style, for the sharing of knowledge about where to find the best fabrics, the most skilled tailors, the most fashionable accessories. You pause at a shop window displaying the latest promenade fashions, and you feel the pull of aspiration, the quiet excitement of seeing how attire evolves, how designers respond to the demands of a ritual that values both tradition and innovation. You notice how fashion plates and style magazines begin to feature dedicated sections on promenade attire, offering guidance on appropriate choices for different occasions, different seasons, different social contexts. You feel how this media attention amplifies the cultural significance of promenade fashion, turning personal choices into public conversations, transforming the simple act of getting dressed for a walk into participation in a broader cultural discourse about taste, propriety, and the aesthetics of public life. You observe how promenade fashion influences broader cultural attitudes toward clothing and self-presentation. You feel how the emphasis on attire designed for movement and visibility encourages a more dynamic understanding of fashion, one that values how garments look and function in motion as well as in stillness. You notice how the ritual of promenading helps legitimize the idea that clothing matters, that what we wear when we move through public space carries meaning, that personal appearance is not merely superficial, but an important dimension of social interaction. You walk among promenaders whose attire reflects this understanding, feeling how fashion becomes not just about looking good, but about communicating, about connecting, about participating in the shared performance of public life. You realize that promenade fashion reflects a deeper truth about human experience, that we present ourselves to the world through layers of choice, that our appearance is shaped by culture, by context, by the expectations of those around us. You feel how the ritual of dressing for a promenade invites attention to the relationship between inner self and outer presentation, between personal identity and social role, between individual expression and collective expectation. You walk through these fashion-conscious promenades, feeling how clothing can be both constraint and opportunity, both mask and revelation, both personal choice and cultural participation. The light begins to soften as you continue walking, and you notice how promenade fashion adapts to changing illumination, how evening attire incorporates elements that catch and reflect artificial light, how fabrics and accessories are chosen not just for daytime visibility, but for their appearance under gaslight or candlelight. You feel how this attention to temporal shifts invites you to notice the subtle transformations that occur as day yields to evening, how the same outfit can project different impressions under different lighting conditions. You notice how this sensitivity to time and light echoes the social rhythms of promenading itself, how both fashion and ritual recognize that meaning emerges not from static observation, but from attentive engagement with change. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of promenade fashion settle into your awareness. You've experienced how the simple act of walking for pleasure can drive meaningful innovation in clothing design, how attire can function as both practical solution and social signal, how the ritual of dressing for public life invites reflection on the relationship between self and society. The promenade dresses, the tailored walking suits, the parasols and gloves and refined silhouettes. They aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders that what we wear when we move through the world matters, that clothing is never merely functional, that the art of public presentation is itself a form of cultural participation. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to explore how the promenade influenced music and dance, how the ritual of walking for display became formalized in ballroom tradition and processional performance. But for now, you let the experience of promenade fashion settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that what we wear doesn't just cover our bodies, it shapes how we move, how we're seen, how we participate in the shared performance of public life, one carefully chosen garment at a time. You feel the rhythm change beneath your feet, not in the texture of the path, but in the pulse of the air itself. The quiet crunch of gravel and the murmur of conversation give way to the swell of strings, the precise beat of a drum, the elegant lift of a melody that seems to lift your steps without you consciously deciding to move in time. You're no longer just walking through the promenade. You're stepping into a dance where the ritual of movement becomes choreographed, where the simple act of progressing through space is elevated into performance, where the boundary between walking and dancing blurs into something both formal and fluid. You adjust your posture without thinking, feeling how your body instinctively seeks the rhythm, how your stride begins to sync with the music that now seems to emanate from the very atmosphere around you. You find yourself in a grand ballroom first, though the space feels familiar, as if the garden paths you've walked have simply been enclosed, elevated, transformed. The grand promenade opens the evening's festivities, not as a casual stroll but as a formal processional, a choreographed entrance that announces your presence with grace and intention. You walk in line now, part of a carefully ordered sequence where position signals status, where pace is measured to the beat of a march, where every step is both personal expression and collective performance. You feel the weight of tradition in your posture, the quiet pressure to execute this ceremonial walk, with the elegance that suggests you understand the language of movement, that you can translate the rhythm of music into the poetry of motion. You notice how the promenade becomes the opening act of ballroom tradition, a way to introduce dancers to the space, to each other, to the evening's possibilities. The music isn't just background, it's instruction, guiding your pace, suggesting your posture, creating the emotional atmosphere that will shape the interactions to follow. You feel how a well-composed processional march can elevate a simple walk into something transcendent, how the interplay of melody and movement can create a shared experience that bonds participants even before the first waltz begins. You walk among strangers who feel like companions, united by the rhythm that guides your steps, by the shared understanding that this moment of procession is both preparation and performance, both individual expression and collective ritual. You transition to the waltz, and the promenade evolves once more. You feel how the processional introduction gives way to partnered dance, how the linear progression of the walk transforms into the circular flow of the waltz, how the music shifts from stately march to lilting triple time that invites a different kind of movement. You notice how the skills learned in promenade, awareness of space, sensitivity to rhythm, grace under observation, translate directly to the dance floor. How the ritual of walking for display becomes the foundation for dancing for connection. You feel how the promenade isn't replaced by the waltz. It's extended, elevated, transformed into a more intimate form of the same essential impulse, to move through space with intention, with grace, with awareness of others. You pause near the edge of the dance floor, observing how the promenade principle continues to shape the structure of formal balls. You notice how certain dances incorporate processional elements, how couples move in patterns that echo the circuits of garden walks, how the choreography of group dances often recreates the social dynamics of promenading, visibility, pairing, separation, reunion. You feel how the music itself sometimes references promenade rhythms, how composers weave the steady pulse of walking into more complex musical structures, creating a subtle continuity between the ritual of arrival and the celebration that follows. You realize that the promenade isn't just a prelude to dancing, it's woven into the very fabric of ballroom tradition, a foundational element that shapes how movement, music and social interaction intertwine. Historians still argue whether the formalization of the promenade in ballroom tradition primarily served to preserve aristocratic social codes in a changing world, or to democratize elite rituals by making them accessible to broader populations through structured instruction. Some scholars emphasize the way ballroom manuals and dance masters codified promenade etiquette, suggesting a conservative impulse to maintain hierarchy through controlled performance. Others contend that the very act of teaching promenade and dance to middle-class aspirants functioned as a form of social mobility, offering tools for participation in cultural practices once reserved for the privileged. You feel both possibilities as you move, the comfort of knowing the steps and the subtle awareness that mastery of form can be both liberation and constraint. You catch a quirky detail that most dance histories politely omit. Some 19th century ballrooms actually employed tempo monitors, musicians or conductors tasked with ensuring that processional marches maintained the exact pace considered most elegant for promenade purposes. Even more peculiar, certain dance masters developed specialized metronomes calibrated to promenade rhythm, allowing students to practice their walking pace at home with the same precision they applied to dance steps. You smile at the idea that even the rhythm of leisure required technical support, that the appearance of effortless grace was itself a carefully rehearsed performance, that the art of walking to music involved its own form of practice and perfection. You notice how gender shapes the musical promenade in profound ways. For men, the processional walk often emphasizes authority and control, the ability to lead not just in dance but in the very rhythm of movement through space. For women, the promenade often emphasizes grace and responsiveness, the art of following not just a partner but the music itself, of moving with elegance within the structures provided. You feel how these gendered expectations create different pressures and possibilities, how the same ritual of moving to music can require different performances of identity based on who you are. You walk through these musical promenades, feeling how rhythm can both reinforce and transcend social roles, how the shared experience of music can create moments of connection that momentarily suspend the hierarchies that structure everyday life. You realize that the musical promenade isn't just about individual performance. It's about community, about the way shared rhythm creates bonds, about the way music can synchronize not just steps but emotions, intentions, expectations. You feel how the ritual of moving together to music extends the promenade beyond the visual into the auditory, creating a multi-sensory experience that deepens the connection between participants. You notice how this musical dimension of promenading creates opportunities for intimacy and expression, for conversations that happen not in words but in the shared language of rhythm and movement, for the kind of understanding that emerges when bodies move in harmony. You pause as the music shifts, feeling how a change in tempo or key can transform the emotional atmosphere of the promenade, how a minor chord can introduce a note of melancholy, how a crescendo can build anticipation, how a sudden silence can create a moment of collective attention. You notice how skilled musicians understand the social function of promenade music, how they use dynamics, phrasing, and timing to guide the emotional arc of the evening, to facilitate connection, to create the conditions for memorable experience. You feel how music doesn't just accompany the promenade, it shapes it, influences it, becomes an active participant in the ritual of public movement. You observe how the formalization of promenade in ballroom tradition influences broader cultural attitudes toward music, dance, and social interaction. You feel how the emphasis on structured movement to music encourages a more conscious relationship to rhythm, to timing, to the interplay between individual expression and collective harmony. You notice how the ritual of promenading to music helps legitimize the idea that dance matters, that movement to music is not merely entertainment but an important dimension of social life, that the art of moving together is itself a form of cultural participation. You walk among promenaders whose steps reflect this understanding, feeling how music becomes not just about listening but about embodying, about connecting, about participating in the shared performance of public life. You realize that the musical promenade reflects a deeper truth about human experience, that we often feel most connected when we move together in rhythm, that music can synchronize not just bodies but emotions, that the shared experience of rhythm can create moments of unity that transcend individual difference. You feel how the ritual of walking to music invites attention to the relationship between sound and movement, between external rhythm and internal pulse, between the music we hear and the music we make with our own bodies. You walk through these musical promenades, feeling how rhythm can be both structure and freedom, both constraint and opportunity, both cultural expectation and personal expression. The light begins to soften as you continue walking, and you notice how promenade music adapts to changing atmosphere, how evening compositions incorporate elements that enhance the intimacy of dusk, how the interplay of acoustic space and musical arrangement can transform the experience of movement as day yields to night. You feel how this attention to temporal shifts invites you to notice the subtle transformations that occur as the evening progresses, how the same music can project different impressions under different conditions. You notice how this sensitivity to time and atmosphere echoes the social rhythms of promenading itself, how both music and ritual recognize that meaning emerges not from static observation, but from attentive engagement with change. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of musical promenades settle into your stride. You've experienced how the simple act of walking can be elevated by music, how dance traditions can extend the logic of promenade into new forms of movement and connection, how the interplay of rhythm and motion can create shared experiences that transcend individual difference. The grand promenade, the opening march, the processional waltz, they aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders that movement and music have always been intertwined, that the art of public presentation often finds its fullest expression when body and sound move together in harmony. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to move beyond the cultural and artistic significance of promenading to explore its modern legacy and global adaptations. But for now, you let the experience of musical promenades settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that rhythm doesn't just accompany our walks. It shapes them, how we move, how we connect, how we turn the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other into a dance with the world around us. You feel the ground beneath your feet change again, but this time it's not a shift in texture or geography. It's a shift in era, in pace, in the very rhythm of public life. The gentle crunch of gravel and the measured cadence of promenading give way to the rumble of engines, the sharp scent of gasoline, the urgent beep of horns that seem to demand you move faster, get out of the way, make room for progress. You're no longer walking through a world designed for the graceful flow of pedestrians. You're stepping into the 20th century, where the automobile doesn't just share the street, it claims it, where suburbanization doesn't just expand cities, it fragments them, where shifting social norms don't just evolve traditions, they replace them with something faster, more private, more efficient. You adjust your pace without thinking, feeling how the pressure to keep up with the times pulls at your stride, how the simple pleasure of walking for its own sake begins to feel like a luxury, like a relic, like something you have to justify rather than simply enjoy. You notice how the rise of the automobile transforms public space almost overnight. Streets that once accommodated pedestrians, carriages, and the occasional bicycle now prioritize the smooth flow of motor traffic, widening lanes, installing traffic signals, erecting signs that tell you where you can and cannot walk. You feel how sidewalks, once generous stages for social display, become narrow margins, afterthoughts in urban design, places to hurry through rather than linger. You walk among pedestrians who keep their eyes forward, their steps quick, their conversations brief, as if the very act of walking has become a problem to be solved rather than a pleasure to be savoured. You notice how the architecture of cities changes to accommodate cars. Parking lots replace parks, drive-thrus replace storefronts, garages replace front porches, and the intimate scale of promenade-friendly design gives way to the monumental scale of automotive infrastructure. You transition to the suburbs, and the sensory landscape shifts dramatically. The dense, walkable neighborhoods of earlier eras give way to sprawling developments, where distances between home, work and leisure require wheels rather than feet. You feel how suburbanization doesn't just change where people live, it changes how they move, how they connect, how they experience public space. The promenade, once a daily ritual woven into the fabric of community life, becomes a special occasion, something you drive to rather than step into, something you plan rather than simply do. You walk through these new landscapes, feeling how the design of suburbs, cul-de-sacs, private yards, shopping centres accessible only by car, discourages casual pedestrian interaction, replacing the spontaneous encounters of the promenade with scheduled playdates, organised events, and the curated sociality of private spaces. You pause near a shopping mall and you notice how commercial spaces begin to absorb some of the social functions once served by public promenades. The enclosed arcade, once a charming feature of urban life, evolves into the climate-controlled megamall where walking is still possible but is now oriented toward consumption rather than connection, where the rhythm of movement is guided by storefronts rather than scenery, where the pleasure of strolling is subtly reframed as the pleasure of shopping. You feel how this shift changes the emotional texture of public walking. It's no longer about being seen for the sake of social connection. It's about being seen as a consumer, as a participant in an economy that values expenditure over experience. You walk through these commercial promenades, feeling how the ritual of walking can be co-opted, repurposed, transformed into something that serves different masters. You observe how shifting social norms accelerate the decline of traditional promenading. You feel how the mid-20th century's emphasis on efficiency, productivity, and private leisure time makes the slow public ritual of promenading seem old-fashioned, inefficient, even slightly suspect. You notice how new forms of entertainment, radio, television, later the internet, offer alternatives to public socializing, ways to connect without leaving home, ways to be entertained without the effort of dressing up, stepping out, navigating the complexities of public interaction. You walk among people who choose to stay in rather than go out, who scroll through feeds rather than stroll through parks, who experience community through screens rather than shared space. You feel how the promenade doesn't disappear, it retreats, becoming nostalgic, becoming optional, becoming something you remember rather than something you do. Historians still argue whether the decline of traditional promenading primarily reflected genuine progress in urban mobility and personal convenience, or represented a loss of valuable social infrastructure that once fostered community, of health and democratic interaction. Some scholars emphasize the benefits of automotive culture, the increased mobility, the expanded access to opportunities, the comfort and efficiency of private transportation, suggesting that the decline of promenading was a reasonable trade-off for modern convenience. Others contend that the displacement of pedestrian-oriented design functioned primarily as a form of social fragmentation, reducing opportunities for spontaneous interaction, weakening community bonds, and contributing to the isolation and sedentary lifestyles that characterize much of contemporary life. You feel both truths as you walk, the genuine appreciation for the freedom that cars provide, and the subtle melancholy of knowing that something valuable has been lost, that the simple pleasure of walking together in public space has become a conscious choice rather than a cultural default. You catch a quirky detail that most urban histories politely omit. Some mid-20th century suburban developments actually included walking paths, designed to mimic promenade experiences, but these were often underused or repurposed because residents preferred the convenience of driving even short distances. Even more peculiar, certain communities experimented with pedestrian-only hours in commercials districts, attempting to recreate the social atmosphere of traditional promenades. But these initiatives often struggled to gain traction in cultures that had already internalized the primacy of automotive mobility. You smile at the idea that even nostalgia for promenading had to compete with the momentum of modern life, that the desire to reclaim pedestrian space required conscious effort in a world that had learned to move faster. You notice how the decline of promenading influences broader cultural attitudes toward public space and social interaction. You feel how the emphasis on private transportation and private leisure encourages a more individualistic understanding of community, one that values personal convenience over collective experience, that sees public space as something to pass through rather than to inhabit. You notice how this shift helps legitimize the idea that walking is primarily a means to an end, a way to get somewhere, rather than an end in itself, a source of pleasure, reflection, and connection. You walk among pedestrians who seem aware of this shift, who sometimes pause to appreciate a beautiful view or a pleasant path, but who often feel the subtle pressure to keep moving, to stay productive, to justify their presence in public space by having a destination in mind. You realize that the displacement of promenading isn't just about transportation or urban design. It's about time, about how modern life compresses leisure into scheduled slots, about how the luxury of unstructured time becomes increasingly rare in cultures that value efficiency above all. You feel how the promenade, with its emphasis on slow, purposeless movement, becomes a kind of rebellion against the pace of contemporary life, a conscious choice to reclaim time for reflection, for connection, for the simple joy of being present in a shared space. You notice how those who continue to promenade, whether in parks, on waterfronts, in pedestrian zones, often do so with a sense of intentionality, of resistance, of preserving a tradition that feels increasingly countercultural. You pause at a viewpoint overlooking a busy highway, watching how the flow of traffic creates a rhythm that feels both powerful and impersonal, both efficient and isolating. You notice how the infrastructure that enables automotive mobility often creates barriers to pedestrian movement, wide roads that are difficult to cross, overpasses that prioritize cars over people, neighborhoods divided by thoroughfares that discourage walking between communities. You feel how the decline of promenading isn't just about changing preferences, it's about changing structures, about how the built environment shapes behavior, about how the design of cities can either encourage or discourage the simple pleasure of walking together in public space. You observe how the nostalgia for promenading begins to emerge even as the tradition declines. You feel how mid-20th century films, literature and advertisings sometimes evoke the romance of evening strolls, of garden paths, of leisurely walks through parks, suggesting a cultural awareness that something valuable has been lost. You notice how this nostalgia doesn't always lead to action, but it does create a space for reflection, for questioning whether the trade-offs of modern mobility were worth the cost, for imagining alternatives that might reclaim some of the social and psychological benefits of pedestrian-oriented design. You walk through these cultural memories, feeling how nostalgia can be both comforting and motivating, both a recognition of loss and a seed for renewal. You realize that the decline of traditional promenading reflects a deeper truth about human experience, that progress often comes with trade-offs, that convenience can sometimes come at the cost of connection, that the structures we build to improve our lives can sometimes reshape those lives in unexpected ways. You feel how the ritual of promenading, with its emphasis on slowness, presence, and public connection, offers a counterpoint to the values that drove its decline, a reminder that not everything valuable can be measured in efficiency, that some pleasures require time, attention, and the willingness to move at a different pace. The light begins to soften as you continue walking, and you notice how the decline of promenading changes the experience of evening in public space. Where once dusk might have drawn people out for a final stroll, now it often signals the end of outdoor activity, the retreat into private spaces, the transition from public to domestic life. You feel how this shift changes the rhythm of community, how the absence of evening promenaders can make public spaces feel emptier, less safe, less inviting, creating a cycle that further discourages pedestrian activity. You notice how this temporal dimension of promenading, the way it structured the day, the way it created natural opportunities for connection at specific times, was itself a form of social infrastructure, one that has been difficult to replace. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of this changed landscape settle into your stride. You've experienced how technological progress, urban redesign, and shifting cultural values can transform even the most deeply rooted traditions. How the simple act of walking for pleasure can become a conscious choice rather than a cultural default. How the loss of pedestrian-oriented design can reshape not just cities but communities, not just movement but connection. The automobiles, the suburbs, the new forms of entertainment, they aren't just historical developments. They're reminders that the spaces we inhabit and the rhythms we follow are always in flux, always shaped by the values and technologies of their time. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to explore how modern urban planning has begun to revive promenade principles, how contemporary cities are rediscovering the value of pedestrian-oriented design for well-being and community. But for now, you let the experience of this decline settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that traditions don't disappear without a trace. They leave echoes, they inspire nostalgia, they plant seeds for renewal, one conscious step at a time. You feel the ground beneath your feet change again, but this time it's not a shift backward or a surrender to nostalgia. It's a deliberate reimagining, a conscious choice to reclaim what was lost without pretending the world hasn't changed. The harsh rumble of traffic softens into the gentle murmur of footsteps, the scent of exhaust gives way to the fresh aroma of planted trees and flowing water, and the urgent pressure to hurry dissolves into the quiet invitation to linger. You're walking through a modern urban revival, where city planners, community activists, and everyday pedestrians are rediscovering the wisdom of promenade principles, adapting them to contemporary needs, and proving that the simple act of walking together in public space still holds power to heal, to connect, to transform. You adjust your pace without thinking, feeling how the rhythm of this renewed pedestrian environment invites you to slow down, to notice, to breathe. You find yourself in a pedestrian zone first, where streets once dominated by cars have been reclaimed for people. The asphalt hasn't disappeared, but its purpose has transformed. No longer a channel for speed, it's now a stage for strolling, for cafe tables spilling onto the pavement, for street performers whose music becomes the soundtrack of your walk. You feel how these spaces aren't just car-free. They're people-centered, designed with benches at inviting intervals, with planters that soften hard edges, with lighting that creates warmth without glare. You notice how the architecture that once faced inward toward private spaces now opens outward, with storefronts, galleries and restaurants engaging directly with the flow of pedestrians, creating a rhythm of discovery that rewards slow, attentive movement. You walk among strangers who feel like companions, united not by destination but by the shared pleasure of occupying public space without apology. You transition to a waterfront park, and the sensory landscape shifts to the gentle lap of water against shore, the cry of gulls overhead, the cool breeze that carries the scent of river or ocean into the heart of the city. You feel how these reclaimed edges, once industrial zones, parking lots or neglected infrastructure, have been transformed into promenades that invite reflection, recreation and connection. The path beneath your feet is designed for accessibility, wide enough for groups to walk abreast, smooth enough for wheels of all kinds, lined with seating that faces the water without blocking the view. You notice how these spaces accommodate different rhythms. Joggers maintain their pace on dedicated lanes, families linger near playgrounds, couples find quiet corners for conversation, and solo walkers claim moments of solitude without isolation. You feel how the promenade principle, graceful pedestrian flow oriented toward beauty and social possibility, has been adapted to serve diverse needs without losing its essential promise. You pause near a community garden integrated into the park design, and you notice how modern urban revival often blends promenade principles with ecological awareness. You feel how native plantings, rain gardens, and sustainable materials aren't just decorative, they're educational, inviting pedestrians to learn about local ecosystems while they walk. You observe how seating areas are positioned to maximize both comfort and environmental benefit, shaded by trees that cool the air, oriented to catch breezes that reduce the need for mechanical cooling, designed to minimize light pollution that disrupts nocturnal wildlife. You walk through these thoughtfully designed spaces, feeling how the revival of promenading isn't just about recreating the past. It's about imagining a future where public space serves both human well-being and planetary health. You observe how the 15-minute city concept echoes promenade principles in profound ways. You feel how this planning philosophy, where residents can access most daily needs within a quarter-hour walk or bike ride, doesn't just reduce car dependency. It recreates the walkable intimacy of earlier urban forms, where community life unfolded at pedestrian pace. You notice how mixed-use development, where homes, shops, schools and parks intermingle rather than segregate, encourages the kind of spontaneous encounters that once defined promenade culture. You walk through neighborhoods designed with this vision, feeling how the scale of buildings, the width of sidewalks, the placement of crosswalks all conspire to make walking not just possible but pleasant, not just efficient but enjoyable. You realize that the 15-minute city isn't a rejection of modernity. It's a refinement, an application of promenade wisdom to contemporary challenges of sustainability, equity and quality of life. Historians still argue whether modern urban revival of promenade principles primarily represents genuine progress toward more humane, sustainable cities or serves primarily as a form of green gentrification that improves public space while displacing the communities who need it most. Some scholars emphasize the health benefits, social cohesion, and environmental gains of pedestrian-oriented design, suggesting that reclaiming promenade principles is essential for building resilient, livable cities. Others contend that the very success of these initiatives, rising property values, increased tourism, enhanced aesthetic appeal, can function as a form of exclusion, making revitalized spaces accessible primarily to those who can afford to live nearby. You feel both truths as you walk: the genuine pleasure of moving through a beautifully designed public space, and the subtle awareness that access to such spaces remains uneven, that the promise of urban revival must be paired with commitments to affordability and inclusion to fulfill its potential. You catch a quirky detail that most urban planning discussions politely omit. Some modern pedestrian zones actually incorporate subtle sensory design elements intended to enhance the walking experience without conscious awareness. Certain pathways use textured paving that changes underfoot to signal transitions between zones, helping visually impaired pedestrians navigate while adding tactile interest for all. Even more peculiar, some waterfront promenades feature soundscaping installations that amplify natural sounds: water, wind, urban noise, creating an acoustic environment that encourages relaxation and attention. You smile at the idea that even the sensory dimensions of walking are being thoughtfully designed, that the revival of promenade principles involves not just spatial planning but multi-sensory experience, that the art of walking well in the 21st century requires attention to how space feels, sounds and smells as well as how it looks. You notice how technology intersects with promenade revival in complex ways. You feel how apps that map pedestrian routes, track walking statistics, or connect walkers with local events can enhance the experience of urban strolling, providing information and community without replacing the fundamental pleasure of movement. You observe how smart lighting that adjusts to pedestrian flow, or benches with integrated charging ports, can make public space more functional without sacrificing its human scale. You walk among pedestrians who use technology as a tool rather than a distraction, who check a map then put the phone away, who share a photo then return their attention to the path ahead. You realize that the revival of promenading doesn't require rejecting modernity. It can incorporate technology thoughtfully, using it to support rather than supplant the simple joy of walking together in public space. You realize that urban revival of promenade principles isn't just about design. It's about culture, about reclaiming the idea that public space belongs to everyone, that walking is a right, not a privilege, that the simple act of moving through a city with other people can be a source of joy, health, and connection. You feel how this cultural shift requires more than good planning. It requires community engagement, policy support, and a willingness to prioritize people over vehicles, experience over efficiency, connection over convenience. You notice how successful pedestrian zones often emerge from grassroots advocacy as much as top-down planning, from residents who insist that their streets can be more than thoroughfares, that their neighborhoods can be places to linger, not just pass through. You posit a viewpoint that overlooks both the revitalized pedestrian zone and the broader city beyond, and you notice how the principles of promenade revival can scale from small interventions to comprehensive planning. You feel how a single car-free street can inspire a network of pedestrian priority routes, how one successful waterfront park can catalyze investment in other underused edges, how the 15-minute city concept can transform entire metropolitan regions. You observe how these initiatives don't just improve individual spaces, they reshape expectations about what cities can be, about how urban life can feel, about the relationship between people and the places they inhabit. You walk with the awareness that every step you take in these revived spaces is both a personal pleasure and a political act, a vote for a certain vision of public life. You observe how the revival of promenade principles influences broader cultural attitudes toward mobility, community, and well-being. You feel how the emphasis on walkable design encourages a more holistic understanding of health, one that values not just physical activity but mental restoration, social connection, and environmental stewardship. You notice how pedestrian-oriented spaces help legitimize the idea that cities should serve people first, that public space is a commons that deserves investment and protection, that the art of moving through a city with grace and attention is itself a form of cultural participation. You walk among pedestrians whose presence reflects this understanding, feeling how the simple act of walking can be both personal practice and collective statement. You realize that the urban revival of promenading reflects a deeper truth about human experience, that we thrive not in isolation but in connection, not in speed but in presence, not in private consumption but in shared experience. You feel how the ritual of walking through thoughtfully designed public space invites attention to the relationship between individual well-being and collective flourishing, between personal pleasure and civic responsibility, between the city we inhabit and the city we imagine. You walk through these revived promenades, feeling how design can support not just movement but meaning, not just function but joy. The light begins to soften as you continue walking, and you notice how modern pedestrian spaces adapt to changing illumination, how lighting design enhances safety without sacrificing atmosphere, how evening promenades become possible again through thoughtful illumination that invites rather than intimidates. You feel how this attention to temporal shifts invites you to notice the subtle transformations that occur as day yields to evening, how the same space can offer different experiences at different times. You notice how this sensitivity to time and light echoes the social rhythms of traditional promenading, how both historical and contemporary practices recognize that meaning emerges not from static observation but from attentive engagement with change. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of urban revival settle into your stride. You've experienced how promenade principles can be adapted to contemporary challenges, how pedestrian-oriented design can serve diverse needs without losing its essential promise, how the simple act of walking together in public space can still heal, connect, transform. The pedestrian zones, the waterfront parks, the 50-minute city, they aren't just planning concepts. They're reminders that the wisdom of the past can inform the possibilities of the future, that the art of public life is always worth reinventing. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to explore how promenade traditions live on in global cultural cousins, how evening strolls and plaza walks continue to shape community life in cities around the world. But for now, you let the experience of urban revival settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that the spaces we walk through don't just contain our lives, they shape them, one thoughtful design choice at a time. You feel the path beneath your feet change again, but this time it's not a shift in era or design. It's a shift in culture, in language, in the subtle rhythms that make each place feel distinct even as the essential impulse remains the same. The gravel gives way to cobblestones worn smooth by generations of evening steps. The air carries the scent of orange blossoms mixed with espresso and sea salt, and the murmur of conversation shifts into melodies you don't quite understand but somehow feel. You're no longer walking through a single tradition. You're stepping into a global family of rituals, where the promenade lives on in countless forms, adapted to local climates, cultures and histories, yet united by the simple, profound pleasure of moving through public space with intention and company. You adjust your pace without thinking, feeling how the rhythm of walking transcends language, how the desire to connect through movement is a human constant that finds expression in every corner of the world. You find yourself in Spain first, where the Paseo unfolds like a daily ceremony, woven into the fabric of community life. You feel how this evening stroll isn't just about exercise or errands. It's about presence, about claiming the twilight hours for connection, about participating in a ritual that has structured Spanish social life for centuries. You walk among families and friends who move at a leisurely pace, greeting acquaintances with warm embraces, pausing to admire the architecture, to watch the sunset paint the plaza in gold, to let conversation unfold without urgency. You notice how the Paseo isn't confined to a single location. It flows through streets, squares and promenades, creating a moving network of social interaction that transforms the entire city into a stage for community life. You feel how this tradition isn't nostalgic. It's alive, adaptive, resilient, a testament to the enduring human need to move together in public space. You transition to Italy, and the passeggiata, greets you with the aroma of fresh bread, the sound of church bells, the gentle clink of glasses from sidewalk cafes. You feel how this ritual, often centered on the main street or corso, serves as both social showcase and community glue, where seeing and being seen isn't vanity but participation, where the simple act of walking together reinforces bonds that sustain neighborhoods through generations. You notice how the passeggiata accommodates different rhythms. Young couples linger near gelaterias, elders exchange news on familiar benches, children dart ahead under watchful eyes, and everyone moves with the unspoken understanding that this time belongs to community, not to productivity. You walk through these scenes, feeling how the passeggiata isn't just a tradition, it's a philosophy, a way of valuing presence over efficiency, connection over convenience, the beauty of shared time over the pressure of scheduled activity. You pause in a Japanese garden path, where sampo, the art of walking for pleasure, takes on a more contemplative character. You feel how this practice, deeply influenced by Shinto and Buddhist traditions, emphasizes mindfulness, attention to nature, and the quiet joy of movement without destination. You notice how sampo isn't always social. Sometimes it's solitary, a way to clear the mind, to observe the changing seasons, to find peace in the rhythm of footsteps on gravel or wood. But you also observe how sampo can be communal, how groups walk together in parks, along rivers, through temple grounds, sharing silence or conversation as the mood dictates. You feel how this tradition reflects a different relationship to public space, one that values subtlety, restraint, and the appreciation of transient beauty. Cherry blossoms falling, autumn leaves drifting, the play of light through bamboo. You walk with awareness, feeling how sampo invites you to notice not just where you're going but how you're moving, not just what you see but how you see it. You transition to Latin America, where evening plaza strolls pulse with vibrant energy, music and color. You feel how these gatherings transform public squares into living rooms for the community, where families spread blankets on stone, where musicians play spontaneously, where the boundary between performance and participation blurs into joyful chaos. You notice how the plaza stroll isn't just about walking, it's about celebrating, about claiming public space as a site of cultural expression, about reinforcing identity through shared ritual. You walk among people whose movements tell stories of migration, of resistance, of joy in the face of hardship. And you feel how the simple act of promenading can become a form of resilience, a way of saying, we are here, we belong, we continue. You notice how these traditions adapt to local contexts. In some places, the stroll centers around religious festivals, in others, around political expression, in still others, around the simple pleasure of cool evening air after a hot day. You observe how these global cultural cousins of the promenade share core principles, while expressing them in distinctive ways. You feel how all of them value slowness in a world that often prizes speed, how all of them prioritize presence over productivity, how all of them recognize that public space is not just infrastructure but community, not just setting but story. You notice how each tradition reflects its cultural context. The Spanish paso emphasizes social warmth and familial connection. The Italian passeggiata balances elegance with accessibility. Japanese sampo cultivates mindfulness and aesthetic appreciation. Latin American plaza strolls celebrate collective joy and cultural expression. You walk through these variations, feeling how diversity enriches rather than diminishes the essential human impulse to move together in public space. Historians still argue whether these global promenade traditions primarily serve to preserve cultural identity in an increasingly homogenized world, or function as adaptive practices that evolve to meet contemporary needs while maintaining symbolic continuity with the past. Some scholars emphasize the way rituals like the passeo and passeggiata create spaces for intergenerational connection, suggesting that these traditions play a vital role in transmitting values, stories, and social knowledge across time. Others contend that the very flexibility of these practices, their ability to incorporate new technologies, accommodate changing demographics, respond to urban transformation, functions primarily as a form of cultural resilience, allowing communities to maintain a sense of continuity while adapting to change. You feel both truths as you walk, the comfort of participating in a tradition that connects you to those who walked these paths before, and the excitement of seeing how that tradition evolves to include new voices, new expressions, new possibilities. You catch a quirky detail that most cultural histories politely omit. Some traditional promenaders actually develop subtle location-specific signals to communicate without words. In certain Spanish towns, the way a fan was folded or held during the paseo could convey everything from availability for conversation to a desire for solitude. Even more peculiar, some Italian passeggiata participants adopted distinctive ways of adjusting scarves or hats that signaled membership in particular social circles or neighborhoods, creating a visual language visible only to those initiated into the code. You smile at the idea that even the most universal human practices, walking, greeting, being present, can develop intricate local dialects, that the art of promenading involves not just movement but semiotics, not just presence but performance. You notice how gender shapes these global traditions in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. In some contexts, evening promenades provide rare opportunities for women to occupy public space without supervision, to socialize freely, to claim visibility on their own terms. In others, promenade rituals reinforce traditional gender roles, with expectations about attire, pacing, and interaction that reflect broader social norms. You feel how these traditions aren't static. They evolve as communities negotiate questions of equality, autonomy, and expression. You walk among promenaders who challenge as well as uphold convention, feeling how the simple act of walking together can become a site of both continuity and change, of both tradition and transformation. You realize that these global cultural cousins aren't just variations on a theme. They're reminders that the human need for connection, for movement, for public presence is universal, even as its expressions are beautifully diverse. You feel how participating in any of these traditions, whether as insider or observer, invites reflection on your own relationship to public space, to community, to the simple pleasure of walking without urgency. You notice how these practices challenge the assumption that modernity requires the abandonment of tradition, showing instead that the most resilient rituals are those that adapt, that the most meaningful practices are those that balance continuity with innovation. You pause at a viewpoint that overlooks a plaza where multiple traditions seem to converge. Families strolling with the warmth of the paseo, couples lingering with the elegance of the passeggiata, individuals walking with the mindfulness of sampo groups, celebrating with the vibrancy of Latin American plaza culture. You feel how these traditions don't compete. They complement, creating a rich tapestry of human experience that honors both universal impulses and local expressions. You notice how the presence of these diverse practices in a single space can foster cross-cultural understanding, inviting participants to appreciate different ways of valuing time, community, and public life. You observe how these global promenade traditions influence broader cultural attitudes toward leisure, community, and urban life. You feel how the emphasis on slow, intentional movement encourages a more holistic understanding of well-being, one that values not just physical health but mental restoration, social connection, and cultural participation. You notice how these practices help legitimize the idea that public space is a commons that deserves protection and investment, that the art of moving through a city with grace and attention is itself a form of cultural expression. You walk among promenaders whose presence reflects this understanding, feeling how the simple act of walking can be both personal practice and collective statement. You realize that these global cultural cousins reflect a deeper truth about human experience, that we thrive not in isolation but in connection, not in speed but in presence, not in private consumption but in shared ritual. You feel how the practice of walking together in public space invites attention to the relationship between individual well-being and collective flourishing, between personal pleasure and civic responsibility, between the traditions we inherit and the futures we imagine. You walk through these global promenades, feeling how culture can support not just movement but meaning, not just function but joy. The light begins to soften as you continue walking, and you notice how these traditions adapt to changing illumination, how evening strolls become possible through the gentle glow of street lamps, the warm light of cafe windows, the natural beauty of sunset. You feel how this attention to temporal shifts invites you to notice the subtle transformations that occur as day yields to evening, how the same space can offer different experiences at different times. You notice how this sensitivity to time and light echoes the social rhythms of promenading across cultures, how both historical and contemporary practices recognize that meaning emerges not from static observation, but from attentive engagement with change. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of global promenade traditions settle into your stride. You've experienced how the simple act of walking for pleasure can take countless forms, how cultural diversity enriches rather than diminishes the essential human impulse to move together in public space, how tradition and innovation can coexist in practices that honor both the past and the present. The Spanish paseo, the Italian passeggiata, Japanese sampo, Latin American plaza strolls. They aren't just local customs, they're reminders that the wisdom of walking together is a global heritage, one that continues to evolve, to inspire, to connect. As you approach the end of this section of path, you feel ready to explore how promenade traditions have transformed in the digital age, how proposals, social media aesthetics, and virtual meetups reimagine ancient rituals for contemporary life. But for now, you let the experience of global cultural cousins settle into your memory, carrying forward the understanding that the paths we walk don't just lead somewhere, they connect us, to each other, to history, to the beautiful diversity of human expression. One step at a time, you feel the path beneath your feet change one last time. But this time, it's not stone or gravel or wood. It's light, it's pixels, it's the soft glow of a screen reflecting in your eyes as you scroll through images of people walking, posing, celebrating, connecting in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to those first aristocrats who strolled through Versailles. You're no longer just walking through physical space. You're navigating the digital transformation of the promenade, where the ancient ritual of moving together in public has been reimagined for an age of filters, hashtags, and virtual presence. You adjust your grip on your phone without thinking, feeling how the simple act of documenting a walk has become part of the walk itself, how the desire to be seen has migrated from garden paths to digital feeds, how the promenade has evolved once more to accommodate a world where presence can be both physical and virtual, both immediate and archived. You notice how proposals have transformed the modern prom from a simple dance into a performative spectacle that begins weeks before the event itself. You feel how these elaborate invitations, chalk art on school sidewalks, flash mobs in parking lots, drone deliveries of corsages, aren't just about asking someone to a dance. They're about creating content, about generating moments worthy of sharing, about participating in a ritual where the asking is sometimes more memorable than the event itself. You walk among teenagers who plan these moments with the precision of event producers, who understand that the prom experience begins not with the first dance, but with the first post, the first story, the first wave of likes and comments that validate the effort. You notice how this digital extension of prom culture doesn't replace the physical event. It amplifies it, creating a multi-layered experience where memory is made not just in the moment, but in the curation that follows. You transition to Instagram walking aesthetics, and you feel how the simple act of strolling has become a visual language all its own. You notice how certain angles, filters, and compositions have become shorthand for mood. The golden hour silhouette against a city skyline, the candid laugh captured mid-stride, the carefully arranged flat lay of coffee cup and sneakers on a park bench. You walk with awareness of the frame, feeling how the desire to create a beautiful image can enhance your attention to light, to composition, to the fleeting moments that make a walk memorable. You observe how these digital promenades aren't just about vanity, they're about connection, about sharing experience across distance, about creating a visual diary that turns ordinary walks into extraordinary memories. You feel how the promenade principle, being seen while moving through space, has found new expression in a world where visibility can be global, instantaneous, and permanent. You pause near a group of friends coordinating a virtual meetup, and you notice how technology has expanded the possibilities of shared walking experiences. You feel how video calls can turn solitary strolls into communal adventures, how fitness apps can connect walkers across continents, How augmented reality games can layer digital narratives onto physical paths. You walk among people who use technology not as a distraction but as an enhancement, who check in with distant friends while appreciating local scenery, who share their route in real time without losing the pleasure of the moment. You realize that the digital transformation of promenading isn't about replacing physical presence. It's about extending connection, about creating new ways to share the simple joy of movement with those you care about. You observe how the modern prom itself has become a curated digital rite, where the event is experienced not just by those in attendance, but by followers who participate through stories, posts, and live streams. You feel how this digital dimension changes the emotional texture of the evening. There's excitement in sharing the moment, pressure in capturing it perfectly, joy in receiving validation from a wider community. You notice how attire, decor, and even dance moves are sometimes chosen with an eye toward how they'll appear on screen. How the prom has become a multimedia performance that unfolds across both physical and digital stages. You walk through these layered experiences, feeling how tradition and technology can intertwine without losing the essential promise of the ritual, to mark a moment of transition with grace, with connection, with the awareness that you're part of something larger than yourself. Historians still argue whether the digital transformation of promenade traditions primarily represents genuine innovation that expands access and expression, or serves primarily as a form of performative consumption that prioritizes appearance over experience. Some scholars emphasize the way social media allows marginalized voices to participate in prom culture, to share their stories, to find community beyond geographic limits, suggesting that digital platforms can democratize traditions once constrained by location and resources. Others contend that the pressure to curate a perfect digital promenade, flawless photos, impressive proposals, viral moments, functions primarily as a new form of social anxiety, encouraging comparison, commodification, and the subtle erosion of spontaneous joy in favor of manufactured content. You feel both truths as you walk: the genuine pleasure of sharing a beautiful moment with friends near and far, and the subtle awareness that the desire to document can sometimes distract from the experience itself. You catch a quirky detail that most digital culture analyses politely omit. Some modern prom attendees actually develop personalized hashtags months in advance, treating them as branding exercises that extend the prom experience into a mini campaign with pre-event teasers, live coverage, and post-event recaps. Even more peculiar, certain social circles have developed unwritten rules about posting etiquette, waiting a respectful interval before sharing group photos, tagging everyone appropriately, avoiding spoilers for those who couldn't attend. You smile at the idea that even digital spontaneity has its own etiquette, that the art of sharing a promenade online involves not just technical skill but social awareness, that the ritual of documenting movement has developed its own subtle codes of conduct. You notice how the digital transformation of promenading influences broader cultural attitudes toward memory, identity, and connection. You feel how the ability to archive walks, to revisit moments through photos and videos, encourages a more reflective relationship to experience, one that values not just the immediate pleasure, but the lasting resonance. You observe how the practice of sharing walks online helps legitimize the idea that everyday moments deserve attention, that the simple act of moving through the world can be worthy of documentation, celebration, and connection. You walk among digital promenaders whose posts reflect this understanding, feeling how technology can enhance, rather than diminish, the human impulse to find meaning in movement. You realize that the digital transformation of promenade traditions isn't just about new tools. It's about new possibilities for connection, for expression, for the preservation of memory. You feel how the ritual of walking, whether physical, digital, or both, continues to serve its ancient purpose, to mark time, to build community, to find joy in the simple act of moving forward with intention. You notice how these digital adaptations don't replace the wisdom of earlier promenade cultures, they extend it, proving that the essential human need for connection through movement can find expression in any era, through any medium. You pause at a viewpoint that overlooks both the physical path and the digital feed on your screen, and you notice how the two experiences can complement rather than compete. You feel how a well-timed photo can enhance your appreciation of a beautiful moment, how sharing a walk with distant friends can deepen your sense of connection, how the act of curating memories can invite reflection that enriches the experience itself. You observe how the most fulfilling digital promenades are those that serve the physical experience rather than supplant it, that use technology to amplify rather than distract from the simple pleasure of walking together in public space. You observe how the digital transformation of promenading influences broader cultural attitudes toward leisure, community, and well-being. You feel how the emphasis on sharing experience encourages a more conscious relationship to presence, to attention, to the interplay between documenting and living. You notice how these practices help legitimize the idea that joy deserves to be shared, that connection matters, that the art of moving through the world with awareness is itself a form of cultural participation. You walk among digital promenaders whose presence reflects this understanding, feeling how technology can support not just documentation but meaning, not just sharing but connection. You realize that the digital transformation of promenade traditions reflects a deeper truth about human experience, that we seek not just to live moments but to make them matter, not just to move but to connect through movement, not just to be present but to share that presence with others. You feel how the ritual of walking, whether on gravel paths or digital feeds, invites attention to the relationship between individual experience and collective memory, between personal joy and shared celebration, between the traditions we inherit and the innovations we imagine. You walk through these digital promenades, feeling how technology can support not just movement but meaning, not just function but joy. The light begins to soften as you continue walking, and you notice how the digital promenade adapts to changing illumination, how evening posts capture the magic of golden hour, how the interplay of natural and artificial light creates opportunities for beautiful images that enhance, rather than distract from the experience of walking itself. You feel how this attention to temporal shifts invites you to notice the subtle transformations that occur as day yields to evening, how the same walk can offer different experiences at different times, how the desire to capture a moment can deepen your appreciation for its fleeting beauty. You continue walking, letting the rhythm of digital transformation settle into your stride. You've experienced how the simple act of walking for pleasure can evolve to accommodate new technologies, how the desire to be seen and to connect can find expression in both physical and digital spaces, how tradition and innovation can intertwine to create rituals that honor both the past and the present. The promposals, the Instagram aesthetics, the virtual meetups, the curated digital rites. They aren't just modern trends, they're reminders that the wisdom of the promenade is adaptable, resilient, enduring, capable of finding new expression in every era. And now, as you reach the end of this long journey through 4 centuries of walking, of ritual, of connection, you feel the gentle pull of rest. The path ahead softens into shadow. The sounds of the world grow quieter, and the weight of history settles around you like a comfortable blanket. You've traced the promenade from its Latin roots to its digital present, from aristocratic gardens to global plazas, from gravel paths to pixelated feeds. You've felt how the simple act of moving forward with intention has shaped cultures, inspired art, built communities, and connected generations. And as you prepare to rest, you carry that understanding with you, that every step you take, whether physical or digital, whether solitary or shared, is part of a story much larger than yourself, a story of human connection, of finding meaning in movement, of walking forward together through the beautiful, fleeting moments that make up a life. So let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders relax. Let the images of garden paths and city boulevards, of ballroom marches and evening strolls, of chalk art promposals and golden hour selfies, drift through your mind like clouds across a twilight sky. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to hold on to every fact. You just need to know that you've walked this path, that you've felt the rhythm of history in your stride, that you've participated in a tradition that continues to evolve, to inspire, to connect. The fan hums softly in the background. The lights are dim. The world outside slows to a whisper. and you, dear walker, are ready to rest. Let the gravel of Versailles, the cobblestones of Rome, the boardwalks of childhood summers, the pixelated paths of today, all of it, dissolve into the gentle darkness of sleep. You've earned this pause. You've walked far enough for tonight. So close your eyes, feel the weight of the day lift, and let the rhythm of your breathing carry you forward, not toward destination, but toward rest. One breath, one step, one quiet moment at a time. End of script. Sweet dreams.